Chapter 22-29. The arched bridge, formed by the power of tens of thousands of factions, continued to extend in the void. The runes that surfaced on the surface of the River of Creation had unknowingly become densely packed. The surface of the River of Creation within a radius of thousands of light years from the portal they were facing was soon filled with runes. This drastic change naturally triggered a drastic change in the River of Creation, causing the River of Creation to shake violently. The power of creation in it began to surge, gradually affecting the power of creation in other areas and the portals in other locations. With this change, many itinerant cultivators who were adapting to the power of creation in the River of Creation could not withstand the drastic change and were swept into the depths of the River of Creation, although they were only sent into the hands of Luo Fan's avatar projection faster. But for the many itinerant cultivators who were watching from the outside, this was because they were swallowed by the River of Creation. This drastic change simply increased the danger level of the River of Creation by 1,000 times. How could the itinerant cultivators not be concerned? At that moment, countless probing methods poured into the River of Creation to help them find the source of this change. The tens of thousands of rulers did not use any means to conceal themselves. They simply gathered outside the River of Creation and used their means. Naturally, it was not difficult for them to detect them. Not long after, the itinerant cultivators who were searching for the source of the change in the River of Creation found them one by one. Gazes gathered from all directions and shrouded the tens of thousands of itinerant cultivators. What are they doing? Are they trying to destroy the River of Creation? Ordinary itinerant cultivators naturally would not think so much and would not divert their thoughts to the almighties behind the River of Creation. To them, the existence of the River of Creation was a great thing. Although they were wary of the River of Creation, it was only against the danger of the endless power of creation in the river. Under such circumstances, when they suddenly saw so many fellow almighties using such a decisive method to deal with the River of Creation, they naturally thought that they were destroying the River of Creation. Thinking about how they were destroying this long river, even though the itinerant cultivators were wary of the itinerant cultivators who had gathered to form a civilization, they could not help but feel angry. It's one thing for you to band together and seize more resources, but now you want to cut off our path of cultivation. This was simply an irreconcilable hatred. At that moment, independent cultivators began to quickly make their way towards the 10,000 camps from all directions. Streaks of light streaked across the sky, leaving behind extremely long traces in the air. Due to the sheer number of itinerant cultivators that had gathered, it looked as though a huge fan-shaped light had appeared out of nowhere in the void of the River of Creation. As for why it was so close to the River of Creation, it was naturally because the itinerant cultivators had gathered in front of the various portals in the River of Creation and were relatively close to the River of Creation. At first, only those rogue cultivators with strong detection abilities were the first to take action because they were able to discover the source of the mutation faster. However, as more and more itinerant cultivators took action, the news of the source of the mutation was gradually made known to other itinerant cultivators. Naturally, more and more itinerant cultivators took action. Although there were many itinerant cultivators who had gathered together to form a civilization, they were ultimately only the majority of the many itinerant cultivators in the entire domain of itinerant cultivators. The remaining itinerant cultivators who had not joined any civilization were many times fewer than the total number of itinerant cultivators. However, compared to any civilization or even tens of thousands of civilizations, they were many times larger in scale. Under such circumstances, the many itinerant cultivators were mobilized and gathered in front of the portal where the civilization was located. The scene was simply like a surging wave that was constantly surging towards this region. An inexplicable pressure gradually pressed down on the essence of the tens of thousands of civilizations. You're just some weaklings who can't see the situation clearly. How dare you bare your teeth? Sensing this change, one of the 10,000 rulers sneered. To them, it was the right thing to do for the many itinerant cultivators to band together and deal with the river of creation as a whole. In this way, those itinerant cultivators who were unwilling to join a civilization were naturally the kind of ignorant people who could not see the situation clearly. How could they possibly be interested in such an existence? In particular, they had become the rulers of this civilization for so many years, and each of them had opened up their own relatively complete world clusters. Compared to the past, their strength had increased tremendously. No matter how many itinerant cultivators there were, they would not be much of a threat to them. Due to these various conditions, at this moment, these rulers were only disdainful and annoyed by the scale of the itinerant cultivators that was many times larger than theirs, but they were not afraid at all. The many itinerant cultivators gradually stopped and continued to pile up around the tens of thousands of factions. Gradually, they seemed to turn into a colorful cloud that surrounded the tens of thousands of factions. I didn't expect you to really take action. You really don't want to live anymore. An itinerant cultivator who had obviously heard some news yelled furiously. The only reply he got was silence. The elite forces gathered by tens of thousands of civilizations were focused on breaking the restriction formation on the surface of the river of creation and guiding the creation energy out of the river of creation. If it wasn't necessary, why would they pay attention to the outside world? Why would they have the time to be distracted? What are they trying to do? An itinerant cultivator asked the other itinerant cultivators in confusion. They want to break the structure of the river of creation and let the creation power escape. An itinerant cultivator who knew a little more said indignantly, "How dare they? The reason why our itinerant cultivator domain has not been drowned by the creation power is completely because of the restriction of the river of creation. If we break the river, the boundless power of creation will spread out. Won't we all be devoured by the power of creation?" The rogue cultivator yelled with a horrified expression. Although the river of creation had been born for a long time, compared to the many itinerant cultivators who cultivated for hundreds of trillion years, this amount of time was not much different from taking a nap and cultivating. Therefore, almost all the itinerant cultivators still clearly remembered the whole process of the river of creation appearing. Even those who did not see it appear with their own eyes had already figured out the whole process through inquiries over the years. In this way, almost all of them clearly knew that when the creation power emerged, the changes that should have appeared should have spread in all directions and spread to the entire itinerant cultivator domain. It was just that after so many years of understanding of the creation energy, if it had developed in the same direction, then they would have been completely immersed in the creation energy. They would have been constantly eroded and assimilated by the creation energy, and they might even have been completely devoured. Just when things were about to go out of control, the Almighty who guided the creation power back then, who was said to be an expert who went against the path of a Tao master and returned from a higher level, created a huge formation. He used his physical strength, great power, and great divine sense to restrict the spread of the creation power, created the river of creation, and even opened countless portals for them to enter the river of creation. Based on all these circumstances, the structure of the river of creation was a life-saving barrier for them. That mighty being who had created this river was clearly their savior. But now, not far away from them, the itinerant cultivators who were huddled together actually wanted to break the structure of the river of creation and release the creation power again, so that the entire itinerant cultivator domain would be immersed in the boundless creation power. This was simply evil. Stop them. We must stop them. If they succeed, we will all be finished. An itinerant cultivator roared. When the other itinerant cultivators heard this, their eyes flashed with murderous intent. Maybe we should wait and see. Suddenly, an itinerant cultivator said, "What do you mean? Are you going to wait until they destroy the river of creation and all of us have no hope before you act?" Another itinerant cultivator said angrily, No, that's not what I mean. I just feel that they don't seem like the kind of people who would commit suicide. They're also in the itinerant cultivator domain. Since they dare to do this, perhaps they have their own plans and judgment. Things might not necessarily develop to the most tragic extent, The itinerant cultivator, who was previously doubtful, said hurriedly. Although he was not a weakling, he could not help but feel nervous when so many experts of the same level as him stared at him as if they wanted to tear him apart. What other possibility is there? They already have a complete world group now. Even if the itinerant cultivator domain is filled with boundless creation power, they have a foothold. In this way, the entire itinerant cultivator domain is filled with boundless creation power, which is even more perfect for them. Another itinerant cultivator said angrily. This caused all the itinerant cultivators to fall silent. The world group was the goal of their cultivation on the 4th level of the Tao Master's Path. It was also the beginning of their cultivation on the 4th level. It could be said that without the world group, no matter how long they stayed on the 4th level, they would only be wandering outside the door. Ascending to a higher level would be an unattainable goal. Under such circumstances, although they could not have a very basic understanding of the world group like the countless disciples of the Tao Masters in the realm of the Tao Master, they even knew how to use various divine senses and various methods to make the heaven and earth, world, and space-time in the world group form a world group system that completely followed their cultivation Tao. However, through various methods and deductions of various legends, they knew how incredible the existence of a world group was and how much stronger they were than before. They also understood that the existence of a world group could indeed resist the creation power. In fact, if the world group was complete and perfect enough, it could even completely repel the creation power and provide a foothold in the boundless creation power for all living beings. At this time, many itinerant cultivators actually believed the judgment of that itinerant cultivator. They felt that the cultivators of those civilizations were doing this to completely envelop the entire itinerant cultivator domain in the creation power. After all, in that case, the existence of a world group would be able to obtain the creation power more easily. And those without a world group would also have more opportunities to obtain the creation power by attaching themselves to the ruler of a world group. However, although almost all of them believed this judgment, the mentality of the many itinerant cultivators was different. Some itinerant cultivators deeply hated it and even wanted to immediately perish together with the itinerant cultivators who were huddling together. Some were thinking about how to curry favor with them. After all, for itinerant cultivators like them, cultivation, improvement, and ascension were the most important things. Apart from that, everything else, such as dignity, was secondary. If they could curry favor with the itinerant cultivators who had a world group so that they could cultivate better, have more opportunities to obtain the creation power, and open up their own world group, they would definitely not be stingy with their heads lowered. It was precisely this difference in thinking that caused the itinerant cultivators, who originally shared a common hatred for a common enemy, to unknowingly weaken a lot. In fact, their plan to immediately attack and directly interrupt the itinerant cultivators' actions could not be carried out immediately, and the scene came to a standstill. The itinerant cultivators' thoughts fell into chaos, but the 10,000 rulers on the other side had no intention of stopping with their rhythm. At this moment, the arch bridge had unknowingly extended to the long river of creation, and it gradually came into contact with the endless runes on the surface of the long river. At this moment, endless power began to surge wildly. The endless runes on the surface of the long river seemed to have suddenly been touched by something, and they began to become chaotic. In the eyes of the rogue cultivators, the result of this change was that the formation that was originally perfect and powerful and could even firmly restrict the power of creation within a long river, began to produce an extremely uncoordinated chaos at the point where the arch bridge came into contact with it. Vaguely, a large amount of Genesis energy began to gather towards the chaotic area from all directions. The terrifying pressure gradually caused the formation to become even more chaotic in this area. Faced with this change, the surrounding itinerant cultivators finally knew that they could not wait any longer. If we let them continue, it will be irreversible. What we need to do now is stop them. At this moment, an old man shouted. His shout received the response of many itinerant cultivators, but also caused some of them to have an indescribable gloominess in their eyes. After saying that, the old man immediately took action. A terrifying might that could faintly suppress all the other itinerant cultivators erupted from his body, and he drew a mysterious trajectory in the void as he charged towards the camp of 10,000 people. The location he was charging at was not the strongest point of the camp, nor was it the weakest point, nor was it the center. Instead, it was a camp that seemed ordinary among the 10,000 camps, but it bore the responsibility of unifying a large portion of the camp's power. If the overall structure formed by these tens of thousands of camps was treated as a formation, then the formation would be extremely powerful. At this moment, the camp that was being attacked was a node of the formation. Although it was not the kind of node that would cause the entire formation to collapse once it was destroyed, it was still a rather important node. Once it was destroyed, the efficiency of the formation would be greatly reduced. Obviously, although the old man did not make a move earlier, he had been carefully observing the huge structure formed by the elites of 10,000 civilizations. At this moment, an indescribably terrifying power was released from the camp. With a single sweep, he had already wiped out the power that was directed at this camp, causing the void to clear up once again. "You're courting death." The ruler of the camp roared furiously at this moment. Clearly, he was the one who attacked just now. However, he had been wholeheartedly controlling the arch bridge to destroy the formation on the surface of the river of creation. Now that he suddenly diverted some power to deal with the power that was charging at him, his support for the arch bridge weakened a little, causing the arch bridge to seem to dim a little. After all, they were facing the river of creation that could overturn the entire territory of itinerant cultivators. Even the rulers of the various civilizations did not dare to be careless. Just now, they had all unleashed their full strength. If they diverted even a little bit of power, it would affect their plan and affect their ability to destroy the formation on the surface of the river of creation. It was precisely because of this that these rulers ignored the siege of the many itinerant cultivators and ignored the various ridiculous speculations the itinerant cultivators had about their thoughts. "How dare you attack His Majesty? You're courting death." At this moment, roars came from all directions among the spectating itinerant cultivators. Chapter 22:30. Many itinerant cultivators had expected this internal strife, causing them to come to a sudden realization. However, more itinerant cultivators were shocked. They stood there with blank expressions, unable to react at all. Although the old man had endured so many attacks, he was still a cultivator who surpassed ordinary itinerant cultivators after all. He would not be completely destroyed by the attacks before he could react. Before the attacks were about to reach him, he had already reacted and made the wisest response. He had chosen to escape with his ability. Even if he had made countless strict preparations, he might not be able to withstand the numerous attacks that were flooding over at this moment. Moreover, things had happened in a hurry. He had not expected that those rogue cultivators would be so decisive. If he had tried to block them, how could he have withstood them? It could be said that he only had one choice at this moment, and that was to hide. Fortunately, the old man was ultimately a powerhouse among the itinerant cultivators. His dodging techniques were extremely clever, and he eventually disappeared into the core of the countless attacks at the last moment. Crack! Swoosh! All sorts of strange noises rang out from the core of the attacks. In the blink of an eye, the surrounding space had already been filled with countless illusory figures. It was as if there were countless heavens and earth, countless worlds, and countless annihilations. In that instant, the entire space had been engulfed. Such a huge commotion, naturally, could not be limited to a small area. Not far away from the old man, many rogue cultivators were caught in the crossfire. They either dodged or blocked the aftershocks of the attacks. It looked like a school of originally calm fish had suddenly scattered in all directions. The scene was intense beyond imagination. Despicable, shameless. The itinerant cultivators who had dodged the attacks roared furiously. However, all they could do was roar angrily. After all, they had too many opponents at this moment. They were truly alone. Even though they were furious, they could only dodge for the time being. How dare you dodge? How dare you resist instead of apologizing for offending His Majesty? One of the itinerant cultivators who had launched an attack roared furiously. He immediately changed his attack and turned to another void. Over there, the old man from before appeared in an instant. Obviously, he'd moved to this area of space after he'd avoided the countless attacks that were at the center of those attacks. The voice of the attacking rogue cultivator gave a signal to the other rogue cultivators, causing them to shift their attacks from their original state of missing their targets to the void. In the face of this wave-like attack, the old man was furious, but he could only choose to dodge again. However, at this moment, someone else finally made a move. Streaks of light shot towards the divine abilities, might, strength, and luster from all directions. In the blink of an eye, they had already clashed with the divine abilities, causing an earth-shattering impact. Powerful shock waves constantly spread out in all directions, causing the surrounding space to be destroyed in the blink of an eye, along with all sorts of bizarre lights. You can join us if you want. Using your companions as a ladder is a little too much. A voice rang out amidst the terrifying impact, echoing in the ears of many rogue cultivators. It was obviously the voice of the rogue cultivator who had stopped the other rogue cultivators from attacking the old man. Hearing this, the expressions of the rogue cultivators who had attacked the old man didn't change at all. They didn't even feel ashamed at all. After all, since they dared to betray their original camp in this situation, it was obvious that they had made up their minds and were ready to risk everything. This kind of rebuke was naturally within their expectations. In this case, how could they change their expressions because of such a small rebuke? It seems like you guys also want to harm His Majesty. You deserve to die as well. Immediately, one of the rogue cultivators said directly. The target of the attack instantly changed from the old man to the rogue cultivator who had spoken. For these rogue cultivators, the merit of killing one enemy was naturally far inferior to the merit of killing a large number of enemies. Now that these rogue cultivators had given them something to use against them, how could they not seize it? At this moment, the scale of the internal conflict began to expand at an unimaginable speed. Originally, there were only a few hundred rogue cultivators attacking the old man, but in just a few breaths, it had become millions of rogue cultivators divided into two camps attacking each other. With this change, their ability to influence the plan created by the tens of thousands of rulers was naturally greatly reduced. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the arch bridge forcibly penetrated the river of creation and opened a small hole on the extremely mysterious formation on the surface of the river of creation that could only accommodate the arch bridge. With this change, the countless runes on the surface of the river of creation around the arch bridge became more and more chaotic. Countless runes lost their positions and trajectories, and they began to collide with other runes. As they collided, they were simultaneously damaged and even annihilated at the same time. These collisions, these damages, and these annihilations caused an even greater impact, causing the runes in a wider area to become chaotic. These collisions increased, and these damages became more and more common, causing the annihilations to appear almost continuously. Under this change, the boundless creation power in the river of creation also reached a peak. In the end, when the runes crossed a certain boundary, the boundless creation power was like a flood that broke through a dam, completely breaking through the runes around the arch bridge. The moment it shattered, an extremely strange sound resounded throughout the entire rogue cultivator's territory, making all the cultivators in the rogue cultivator's territory suddenly understand that a shocking upheaval was occurring somewhere in the rogue cultivator's territory. Boundless creation power gushed out from the hole on the surface of the river of creation and directly drowned the arch bridge. Although the arch bridge itself was a product condensed from the essence of many civilizations, it was still much weaker than the creation power. In particular, the moment the creation power broke the shackles, the arch bridge became even more fragile. Almost immediately, it shattered in the torrent of the creation power. In the blink of an eye, it turned into countless fragments and rushed towards the source of the arch bridge along with the torrent, which was the tens of thousands of factions formed by the rulers of tens of thousands of civilizations. It's over. It's over. The rogue cultivators' eyes were filled with despair, and almost all of them lost their voices. Those who could speak could only repeat similar words over and over again. As for their internal strife, it was naturally impossible for them to continue. For the traitors, this phenomenon had already achieved their goal, so there was naturally no need for them to take action anymore. For those who originally objected, this situation meant that all their efforts had failed, so there was naturally no need for them to take action anymore. "Please take us in, Your Majesty." The traitors only shouted at this moment, their eyes filled with anticipation, excitement, and uneasiness. Although they seemed to have obtained the promise of the rulers of the civilizations with their resoluteness previously. In fact, everything was just what they thought they were doing. The rulers of those civilizations did not give them any hints at all, and it was not even certain if they were aware of their existence. Therefore, at this moment, when things came to a head, they began to feel uneasy and could not display the resoluteness that they did when they attacked brazenly. Obviously, none of the rulers of those civilizations cared about these rogue cultivators. To these rogue cultivators, the rulers of those civilizations were breaking the long river of creation, allowing the creation power to directly fill the entire territory of the rogue cultivators, bringing great convenience to their cultivation. However, to the rulers of those civilizations, their goal was not what the rogue cultivators thought at all. Their goal was not to fill the entire territory of the rogue cultivators with the creation power, but to create a tributary of the long river of creation that was under their control. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly care about these rogue cultivators who had guessed wrongly? Even if these rogue cultivators had paid a huge price to help them previously, it was impossible to change their determination. At this moment, the various powers, lights, and abilities emitted by the tens of thousands of camps suddenly changed. From the arched bridge that was originally gathered in the void, it transformed into another form. Starting from the long river of creation, it continuously outlined and combined in the void, forming one complex structure after another, forming unimaginably complex formations in the eyes of the rogue cultivators. As the boundless creation power gushed out, it didn't just charge forward. Instead, it expanded and spread in all directions of the long river of creation. It was expanding and spreading endlessly. In this way, if there were no restrictions on the power, the hole on the surface of the long river of creation would definitely continue to expand until the entire long river of creation was completely severed, allowing the endless creation power contained in it to be released without any restrictions. It would truly spread across the entire territory of the rogue cultivators, causing the entire territory of the rogue cultivators to fall into the state that the rogue cultivators were worried about. At this moment, as the mysterious and complicated formations created by the tens of thousands of camps that contained all sorts of unfathomable profundities began to appear, gradually enveloping the surface of the long river of creation that was getting larger and larger, the power that was spreading in all directions was instantly contained. PFFF. At this moment, countless cultivators from the tens of thousands of camps spurted out blood, dyeing the tens of thousands of camps red. It looked as if a blood-red mist had enveloped the camps. What a strong pressure! One of the rulers of the civilization grunted and spat out the words that seemed normal, but actually contained boundless shock. Compared to the rogue cultivators under him, he naturally performed much better. Of course, he didn't vomit blood. However, even if he didn't vomit blood, his expression changed. It was obvious that the impact he endured was not ordinary. Hold on. If we can't hold on, we're doomed. A ruler of a civilization roared at this moment, but he used his powerful will to encourage the other rulers. Is there a need to say that? Who's more foolish than anyone else? The ruler who said that the pressure was strong sneered. As he spoke, the rulers released the power of the world group that was many times more powerful than before. It poured into the camp, and through the camp's control channel, It was transmitted to the formations that were spewing out the power of creation, doing their best to strengthen the formations. After all, they had been planning for such a long time. Although the changes in front of them were intense, it was actually within their expectations at this moment. Although they were all shocked by the terrifying impact of the creation power, none of them panicked. Not a single one of them panicked. The formations created by the many camps continued to extend along with the creation power, trying their best to keep up with the creation power and trying their best to limit the creation power that had turned into a river that was rapidly extending toward them. They actually want to control the long river of creation. The rogue cultivators outside finally saw what the rulers of these civilizations wanted to do, and they were all extremely shocked. One must know that the existence of the long river of creation was billions of times greater than them. Even if their imagination was increased by 100 or 1,000 times, they did not dare to imagine that they would be able to control the long river of creation one day. Not to mention controlling it. They only dared to think about moving freely in the long river, and they did not dare to be sure that they would be able to achieve it. However, under such circumstances, those rogue cultivators who were clearly just a group huddling program actually dared to have the wild idea of controlling the long river of creation and drawing out a tributary from it. How could they not be shocked by this ability, this method, and this boldness? As for the traitors who had brazenly betrayed them, their expressions changed constantly. This situation was indeed a good thing for the other rogue cultivators. It was enough for them to avoid the danger of the entire rogue cultivator territory turning into an extremely harsh environment for them, and they finally had the right to continue living. However, to them, this was the worst news they could have ever received. Without that harsh environment, wouldn't what they had done previously be in vain? How would those rogue cultivators who had been betrayed look at them afterward? How would the powerhouses who had been attacked by them treat them? At the thought of those various terrifying methods, the rogue cultivators could not help but feel numb, and their expressions became increasingly ugly. If this was any other time, many rogue cultivators would probably mock them and even attack them. However, it was clear that this was not normal. Right now, the rulers of those civilizations were working hard to tame the tributary that extended from the long river of creation. If they were not careful, the worst situation that they had expected would happen. It could be said that they were already on the brink of life and death. They did not even have the time to be nervous and work hard to find a stronger chance of survival for themselves. How could they still have the mood to mock these traitors? To deal with these traitors? Give it to me. Split. The ruler of the civilization outside the door roared at this moment. With this roar, the eyes of the rulers of the various camps flickered, and the methods that they used to control this camp began to change. As the methods changed, the formations that surrounded the tributary of the long river of creation began to expand continuously, surging continuously, and gradually seeping into the creation power. PFFF, PFFF, PFFF. At this moment, sounds of people vomiting blood came from the various camps again. It was all the rogue cultivators who vomited blood at the same time. That's right, this time, it was not almost all of them, but all the rogue cultivators vomited blood. Moreover, this scale was at least 10 times stronger than before. Some rogue cultivators even spat out their own internal organs from their throats. After such a change, the blood-colored mist in the tens of thousands of camps became denser, and the tragic aura skyrocketed many times compared to before. As they paid such a huge price, the tributary of the long river of creation that gushed out gradually diverged from the original one, turning into one after another, forming waves after waves. From the looks of it, there were tens of thousands of them. It just happened to correspond to the various camps. This appearance looked as if tens of thousands of strands of hair that were originally clenched together suddenly scattered in a certain position, scattering into a dense mass. With this change, the terrifying impact of the tributary that originally converged together began to be dispersed to the tens of thousands of even smaller tributaries, weakening the terrifying impact that was originally impossible to resist to the point where there was a trace of hope to resist. Sensing the changes in the tributary, The rulers of the various civilizations were overjoyed. We can succeed. Such thoughts flashed through their minds. At this moment, just as the rulers were looking forward to the final result, congratulatory voices came from all directions. Congratulations to the leaders for creating a new era. Along with the congratulatory voices, countless figures wrapped in the power of the worlds appeared around the tens of thousands of camps. Chapter 22:31. You're going too far. We're just doing this for the safety of the independent cultivators. You have to admit that you can't hold on much longer, one of the independent cultivators said calmly. The independent cultivator who spoke had the power of the world group around him. In fact, this power was much stronger than the power of the world cluster that lingered around the 10,000 rulers. They existed in the void, and as they surged, illusory figures were born in the void. It was as if a world, and a space-time were appearing in all directions. Looking at the number of cultivators that had appeared, it was at least 100 times more than the total number of cultivators in the 10,000 factions. It was almost impossible for so many cultivators to appear out of nowhere, but at this moment, their appearance seemed so natural, as if they had always been here. In fact, compared to the tens of thousands of independent cultivators, they had been here for a long time, but had only revealed themselves now. Hearing this voice, the expressions of the 10,000 rulers who were originally here became extremely ugly. Shameless. When the new cultivators appeared, they followed an extremely subtle and mysterious law, and the positions they appeared in were extremely exquisite. They vaguely formed a formation that was even more powerful than the tens of thousands of camps combined. At this moment, they completely ignored the argument of the higher-ups. Their power, and abilities all surged out and began to combine in various indescribable ways. They produced a supreme power that was countless times stronger than the 10,000 factions combined. Among the 10,000 factions, there were 10,000 rulers. Compared to the tens of thousands of factions, there were over 100 times more cultivators. But the number of rulers was not just 100 times more, but over 1,000 times more. While the low-level cultivators were setting up the formation according to their plan, the rulers were all preparing. The power of their world group was brewing in their bodies, waiting for an opportunity to erupt. The 10,000 rulers were so furious that they wanted to tear the new peach pickers apart with their teeth. However, they did not have the determination to perish together with them. At this moment, they did not even dare to withdraw the formation that had restrained the 10,000 tributaries of the river of creation and use their power to fight against the new independent cultivators. At this moment, they even had to make way for the new independent cultivators to avoid a huge conflict between their formation and the formation they had set up. Under this kind of rational and helpless cooperation, the new formation began to cut into the original formation bit by bit, gradually covering the original formation and gradually enveloping the tens of thousands of tributaries. Seeing this, the eyes of the 10 million rulers that had just appeared lit up. The power of their world group erupted and poured into the formation that their subordinates had set up. It flowed along the formation and merged with every aspect of the formation. It turned into the foundation of the formation and made the formation even more stable and powerful. At this moment, the formation began to exert force and forcefully cut into the 10,000 tributaries of the river of creation. As countless runes surged madly, an incredibly powerful backlash was fed back through the incredibly powerful formation. It was transmitted into the bodies of the newly appeared rogue cultivators, causing all of them to groan in an instant. Some of the rogue cultivators could not withstand the backlash and spat out blood. Although the situation was slightly better than the tens of thousands of rogue cultivators, it was not much better. As for the original 10,000 independent cultivators, they were already experienced and relaxed their power at the critical moment. Although they suffered a certain backlash, it was not to the point where their bodies were injured to the point where they had to spit out blood to alleviate the backlash. At this moment, their performance was much better than the 100 times the number of rogue cultivators outside. Seeing that the rogue cultivators were covered in a bloody mist, the rogue cultivators couldn't help but have a hint of schadenfreude on their faces. Obviously, they held a grudge against the rogue cultivators for plucking the fruits of their labor. At this moment, the river of creation that had been separated began to tremble slightly. Every tributary of the river of creation that had been divided into 10,000 small tributaries continued to be cut and divided under the effect of a new formation. Every tiny tributary naturally divided into thousands of even smaller tributaries, surging towards the vast void in an even more open manner than before. This scene was like the roots of a large tree being separated from the main body of the river of creation. In the beginning, there was only one main root. Although it was twisted and irregular, it still looked orderly. However, after the main root extended for a certain distance, it suddenly split and grew 10,000 roots that were 10,000 times smaller than the main root. Because these tens of thousands of tiny roots extended in all directions, the area they covered was several times wider than the main root from before. After that, the tens of thousands of roots extended a certain distance. Then they actually cut again and became even finer. From each tiny root, over 1,000 tendrils were once again branching out. In this way, the river of creation that was originally only a tributary turned into tens of millions of tributaries. The area covered by the tributaries of the river of creation was more than 100 times wider than when there were 10,000 roots previously. Just like that, when the roots extended to the area where the many itinerant cultivators were, the total area covered by the roots had increased to a radius of several thousand light years. Hurry up and use whatever means you have. You can pluck the fruits of your labor, but if you mess things up after plucking the fruits, you can go to hell. The ruler of this civilization roared at this moment. His voice was filled with anxiety and helplessness. If there were only tens of thousands of roots, he could still think of a way to seal the river of creation so that the power of creation would not be endless and spread endlessly throughout the territory of the rogue cultivators. However, although each of the roots had become 1,000 times thinner, their number had also increased by 1,000 times. This number was no longer something that he could control. Therefore, even if he was extremely unwilling and wanted to use his teeth to bite those independent cultivators who plucked the fruits of creation into pieces, he had no choice but to place his hopes on those people. After all, if he couldn't handle it, the river of creation would wreak havoc, and the entire territory of the independent cultivators would be finished. By then, perhaps the rulers could rely on their own worlds to survive freely in the endless power of creation. But what about the others? Could they take all the independent cultivators in the territory of the independent cultivators into their own worlds? Even if they were willing to open their worlds without reservation, their worlds could not accommodate so many independent cultivators. Don't worry, since we dare to make a move. How can we not be confident? You just have to watch. At this moment, a ruler who appeared later smiled faintly. As he spoke, the void in the surroundings began to distort, and the silhouettes of the world clusters appeared in front of the roots, blocking the path that the roots were extending. So, your worlds can actually sublimate to such an ability. No wonder you could appear here in such a strange way. The ruler of this civilization had an inexplicable look of resentment on his face. These independent cultivators did not obtain the true method of constructing a perfect world group and could not use the most direct method to arrange the worlds according to their cultivation path. Therefore, they could only use a method similar to Luo fans, which allowed the worlds to naturally resonate with them and naturally change according to their own cultivation path. Moreover, because they did not have enough power of creation, this kind of natural adjustment could not be fully carried out. They could only change it bit by bit, and could not achieve what Luo Fan did in the territory of the Tao Master, where he could constantly adjust the worlds to his own cultivation path. In this way, it would be almost impossible for them to be like the disciples of the Tao Master and gather all the power that the world group could bring. In other words, if these independent cultivators with their own worlds fought against the disciples of the real Tao Master, none of them would be able to compare to the disciples of the Tao Master. Moreover, the gap might be huge. This was the fundamental reason why the disciples of the Tao Master did not choose this kind of cultivation method. However, this did not mean that the cultivation of the independent cultivators was not unique. Moreover, on the contrary, because of their intermittent improvement, the power of the world group that they could obtain grew step by step, allowing them to obtain a special characteristic that the Tao Master's disciples did not have. That was, they had unknowingly sublimated all kinds of indescribable mysterious abilities from the power of the world group. These mysterious abilities were formed according to the different cultivation paths of the independent cultivators and according to the degree of adjustment and perfection of the world group of the independent cultivators. It could be said that the special ability that each independent cultivator had sublimated from a certain stage of the power combination of the world group was unique, just like the superpower that the legendary people with superpowers obtained for most of the independent cultivators who owned a world group. The abilities they obtained from the combination of the power of the world group at a certain stage were not very useful. They were not as useful as their own methods, so they were not taken seriously by those independent cultivators. However, there were countless abilities, and most of them were useless. Obviously, some of the abilities that the independent cultivators obtained were not useless. Instead, they had unimaginable uses and could even make those independent cultivators achieve achievements that would leave countless ordinary independent cultivators dumbfounded because of their abilities. At this moment, among the newly appeared independent cultivators, the ability of one of the rulers clearly had the qualifications to make ordinary independent cultivators dumbfounded. "You flatter me." A faint smile appeared on the ruler's face as he replied. As he smiled, his expression suddenly changed, and many pores on his body suddenly spewed out a mist of blood, directly turning a large area of the void around him blood red. Ha ha! Seeing this, the ruler of the civilization suddenly laughed out loud. "You really use your own ability to block all the power of creation. Who do you think you are? Do you think you are the Almighty who opened up the long river of creation? Let's see how many lives you have to die." The ruler of the civilization laughed out loud, and his expression was filled with boundless anger. This was also to be expected. He had painstakingly contacted so many rulers, gathered so many people's wisdom and abilities, and cut open a hole in the long river of creation in an environment that almost all the independent cultivators thought was impossible, allowing them to see the dawn of transcending the control of the long river of creation. However, when this dawn appeared, some rulers that he had contacted before but rejected him forcibly interfered and reaped the fruits of his labor. One could imagine the grievance and anger that this brought about. He was already very rational not to perish together with these rulers immediately. At this moment, the large number of independent cultivators in the surroundings had already dispersed and disappeared without a trace. In this place, only the two nested formations that these rulers and their many elites constructed, as well as the long river of creation that turned from 1 to 10,000 and then into 10 million, were left. Behind these two nested formations was the civilization outside this door, dozens of light years later. There were also a large number of independent cultivators among them. These independent cultivators were cultivators who attached themselves to this civilization and were also a part of this civilization. At this moment, they were all horrified as they looked from afar at the numerous roots that continued to spread and seemed to be about to completely drown the formations, as if they could see boundless waves surging towards them. An indescribable despair made them stand there in a daze. These independent cultivators who attached themselves to the civilization but were not selected to build the formations that were made up of tens of thousands of factions were existences that had been abandoned. They did not even know what exactly was happening, and their ability to respond was not small compared to the many elites. Many of them were caught in a dilemma at this moment. They wanted to leave, but they did not know where to go. They wanted to stay, but they did not dare to be sure that it was safe here. It was because of this dilemma that they behaved this way at this moment, and they could not float away like the other independent cultivators. It stopped. At this moment, an independent cultivator in this civilization exclaimed, This exclamation made many of the independent cultivators feel at a loss, and they could not help but look at the end of the long river of creation and the end of the roots. On the roots, the illusory figures of the world clusters rapidly evolved and quickly changed from their original illusory state to the appearance of the real world clusters. At this moment, the creation energy that was constantly extending and pushing forward stopped. It was as if the illusory figures of the world clusters were constantly absorbing it. A world cluster might have an infinite space inside, but from the outside, its size could be big or small. Perhaps it could fill all the voids, or perhaps it could be as small as a speck of dust. As for how it would appear, it would depend on how the owner of the world clusters said it. It also depended on the thoughts of the people watching from the outside. At this moment, it had been far too long since the territory of the independent cultivators had been covered by the power of creation. Therefore, in the eyes of almost all the independent cultivators, the void without the power of creation was unknowingly regarded as an existence similar to the void in the universe. The scale of space in this existence was naturally closer to the scale of the void of the universe. In other words, the distance of light years didn't exist in the first place. It was just a special characteristic that the independent cultivators in the independent cultivators' territory gave the void. In this way, those clusters of worlds were naturally equivalent to clusters of nebulae that were neither too big nor too small in their eyes. Although the interior was extremely huge, it only looked like a galaxy from the outside. Therefore, at this moment, in the eyes of the many independent cultivators in the civilization, there were clusters of nebulae blocking the tributaries and constantly absorbing the creation energy from the tributaries. If that's the case, we might be able to completely block them. An independent cultivator mumbled with an indescribable look of anticipation on his face. They couldn't be more clear about the dangers of the creation energy. If they were completely covered by the creation energy, none of them were confident that they would be able to come out unscathed. Under such circumstances, compared to the independent cultivators who dared to join the various camps or even watch from the sidelines, they were more afraid of the domain of the independent cultivator's territory, filled with the creation energy. It's indeed possible, but the prerequisite is that he can withstand the pressure of the river. At this moment, an inexplicable voice entered the ears of the independent cultivators. Shortly after, a figure appeared in the void. It was the figure of a legendary figure in the eyes of many independent cultivators, the figure of the Almighty who had endlessly helped the entire independent cultivators' territory. Chapter 22:32. At this moment, Luo Fan was naturally nothing more than a clone projection. He hovered in the void in front of this civilization and watched the tens of millions of tributaries of the river of creation being forcefully blocked by the tens of millions of world clusters projections and devoured the boundless creation energy within. With his knowledge, he could naturally tell that the tens of millions of world clusters originated from the world clusters of itinerant cultivators. However, although the source was the world clusters, they were not the actual bodies of the world clusters after all. Instead, they were merely projections created by some sort of ability. After such projections absorbed boundless creation energy, they could naturally turn into reality. In fact, they could even cause the source of the projections, which was the world clusters, to move over and fuse with them through mysterious changes. However, at this moment, before they turned into reality, in order to support the existence of the projections of the world clusters, it was not the source of the world clusters, but the owner of the ability to project the projections of the world clusters. In other words, it was an itinerant cultivator who already had a world cluster. It was a ruler who ruled over a certain civilization outside a certain door in the river of creation. It was also the person who suggested, planned, and directed this operation to pluck the peaches. As such, the impact and pressure of the creation energy that the projections of the world clusters withstood would naturally be transferred to the ruler through this ability and be used on the world clusters themselves. Such pressure should have been enough to spread the creation energy to the entire itinerant cultivator realm. How could it be completely stopped by an itinerant cultivator? It could be said that at this moment, the itinerant cultivator was actually in a race against time. He had to turn the world clusters into reality as soon as possible and get them out of the projection state so that the pressure of the creation energy would be transferred to the world clusters themselves. If he could complete all of this before his body and mind completely collapsed, he would naturally be fine. Not only would he be unharmed, but the terrifying pressure would also allow his world clusters and his body to be greatly enhanced. In the end, his cultivation realm would take a huge leap forward. However, if he had been a little slower, he would have been unable to withstand the pressure before the projection of the world cluster could receive the power of creation. Then, the final outcome would have been his body and mind collapsing. He would have died and his soul would have dispersed. I wonder if he regrets it now. Luo Fan floated outside the civilization and muttered, "Greetings, Senior. Thank you, Senior, for creating the river of creation and providing us with hope for cultivation." At this time, many rogue cultivators knelt behind Luo Fan and shouted. No matter how dangerous the river of creation was, no matter where the individual cultivators who entered the river of creation went, no matter whether they died or entered the realm of the town master, as those optimistic fellows guessed, nothing could change the fact that the appearance of the river of creation had completely changed the cultivation prospects of all individual cultivators. None of them could change the fact that the creator of the river of creation had given them a ray of hope in their despairing cultivation prospects. A wisp of hope that they had painstakingly sought for hundreds of millions of years. Under such circumstances, since these rogue cultivators had recognized Luo Fan, how could they not come forward to express their gratitude? Moreover, they were now hoping that Luo Fan would protect them, so naturally, they could not withhold their gratitude. Luo Fan stood there quietly and faintly said, "There is no need to be grateful. I have my own plans, my own plans. Perhaps, in the end, you will regret your current gratitude." Listening to these ambiguous words, many of the rogue cultivators were secretly stunned, and all kinds of ominous premonitions arose in their hearts. Although these rogue cultivators were much less courageous than other rogue cultivators. After all, they were powerful existences who had entered the fourth level of the Tao Master Path through their own efforts. How could they be stupid? After hearing Luo Fan's words, they thought too much, and all kinds of doubts emerged from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment, all of their expressions changed dramatically, and their eyes became somewhat inexplicable. Could it be that there really is a conspiracy? Could it be that he really set a trap for us? The scene fell silent because of the thoughts of the rogue cultivators. Luo Fan did not care about all of this. He just quietly looked at the tens of millions of tributaries of the river of creation and the tens of millions of worlds in front of him. As his perception circulated, he reflected the situation of every single world group and tributary into his heart. Very quickly, he confirmed which world group was in charge and who the ruler was. He narrowed his eyes and locked onto that rogue cultivator. At this moment, the rogue cultivator was constantly spewing out blood mist, and the power of the world group was constantly being released from his body. However, it quickly disappeared into the surrounding void, as if the surrounding void was a black hole that was frantically devouring everything. Compared to this ruler's tragic state, the other rulers did not fare much better. They were also spewing endless blood mist and had also suffered great damage in the process. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had to spend some effort to determine that the independent cultivator was the source, the true source of the group of worlds' might. Otherwise, if he was the only one spewing blood while the others did not suffer any damage or change at all, even a fool would know that something was wrong with him and that he was the one under the greatest pressure. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. In a flash, he had already arrived before the projection of the world cluster corresponding to the leader. Although it was a projection of the world group of all participating rulers, there were still differences between the people in it. How could the world group of others be treated the same as his own world group? This ruler was not the kind of person who would absolutely sacrifice himself. To him, It was a matter of course for the benefits to be tilted towards him during the process, so that he could obtain more benefits in the process. Arriving in front of the phantasm of the world group, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved it in the air. The phantasm of the world group trembled slightly and naturally dispersed, turning into a cosmic starry sky that scattered in all directions. Along with this change, the expression of the leader in the central camp changed drastically. With a loud bang, his entire body exploded and an unparalleled power was released from his body, completely shredding the surrounding space. Many of the rogue cultivators not far away from him were devoured by the power, and their bodies directly exploded under the power. This was a formation that could divide the tens of thousands of tributaries into tens of millions of tributaries. It was an extremely intricate and mysterious formation to begin with. For such a formation, once a part of it was damaged, it would be reflected on the formation as a whole. Even if there were all sorts of compensatory and replacement measures that would not cause the entire formation to collapse because of the slightest negligence or damage, the efficiency and strength of the formation would definitely be greatly affected at this moment. The entire formation that divided the tens of thousands of tributaries into tens of millions of tributaries began to tremble slightly. The restraining force on every tributary began to weaken at this moment. If the creation force was just a stable stream of water, then this change wouldn't have caused too great of a change. At most, the tributaries would just tremble a few times. But obviously, this didn't exist. The creation force was a supreme force that could split the heavens and earth and could completely devour rogue cultivators. The fact that they were restrained in the tributaries was already a change that went against the rules of its operation. At every moment, the creation force was constantly releasing incredible pressure in all directions to crush the formation that enveloped the tributaries. Under such circumstances, the force that was restraining the tributaries suddenly weakened, and the creation force was naturally affected. The boundless pressure seemed to have found an outlet and began to crazily pour out. The swaying tributaries constantly condensed and exploded. As they crazily crushed, the tributaries of the river of creation began to surge and distort. It was even to the extent that after a few breaths of time, one of the tributaries emitted an enormous bang that shook the heavens and the earth, and it suddenly exploded into pieces. Endless creation force gushed out from the tributaries at this moment and began to frantically spread across the entire rogue cultivator territory. **T. Cries of alarm came from all directions. Immediately afterward, figures began to quickly flee into the distance, trying their best to stay as far away from the place where the creation force was spreading. Damn it, what's going on? That trash was so confident before, but now he can't do it anymore. The ruler of this civilization was shocked and furious at this moment, and an indescribable resentment appeared on his face. However, it was only resentment, and it hadn't reached the level of despair. After all, after this series of changes, even if the other rogue cultivator's plan succeeded, the benefits wouldn't be too great for him. In fact, he might even be reduced to a state that was only slightly better than ordinary rogue cultivators. And once the plan failed, although he would suffer huge losses, he would still be able to survive freely under the numerous creation force with the world cluster. In fact, his cultivation environment would even be much better than before. In this way, this kind of situation that was almost hopeless for an ordinary rogue cultivator was nothing to him. In fact, his resentment at this moment was mostly because the ruler forcefully snatched his plan, but didn't have the ability to carry it out. Making a mess of the plan, this naturally wasn't enough to make him feel despair. It's him. At this moment, a voice filled with fear and despair entered his ears. Instinctively, he already knew who this him was. The ruler, who was originally just resentful during the drastic change, finally showed a trace of despair on his face at this moment. He scanned his surroundings with his perception and instantly locked onto a figure that was floating in front of a collapsed world cluster. It was a figure that didn't hide its intentions at all. It was a figure that looked extremely familiar and had even become an unshakable and undefeatable representative in his memory. It was the figure of the great being who had created this river of creation. It was the figure that he believed had some sort of scheme and was using all the rogue cultivators as some sort of chess piece. The initial plan has come to fruition. At this moment, one of the rogue cultivators mumbled with a kind of fervor and despair in his eyes. That rogue cultivator was none other than the researcher who first proposed this plan to the ruler of this civilization. Back then, the researcher had only proposed this plan to confirm if there was some sort of scheme behind the river of creation. As for the benefits that the tributaries of the river of creation would bring to the rogue cultivators, everything else was only secondary. It was just that after many changes, the tributaries eventually became the focus of the many rogue cultivators and rulers. Instead, they unknowingly neglected the original goal. Now, as soon as Luo Fan appeared, he ruined everyone's plan and caused the rivers that they created to distort, change, and collapse. However, this was in line with the initial outcome that the researcher had expected when he first proposed a plan. His words were heard clearly by the rulers and rogue cultivators who were already extremely vigilant. In an instant, the expressions of the rulers who knew what was going on became even grimmer. For such words to appear at this moment was simply a direct accusation of how unnecessary their previous actions were. Meanwhile, the rogue cultivators who originally did not know what the plan was and were only following orders. In other words, the members of the various civilizations all had bloodshot eyes, and their expressions were filled with extreme hatred. They had always been told how many benefits this plan would bring them and how much smoother their cultivation would be in the future. However, they had never been told that this plan was actually just a test of success and failure. At this moment, they naturally felt like they had been betrayed. In the face of such emotions, the strings of their rationality were almost about to snap at any time, and their expressions of hatred gradually turned ferocious. As the emotions of the rogue cultivators changed, the array formation that was already on the verge of collapse began to shake even more. Originally, this array formation could still last for a long time and even had a chance to repair its damage. However, at this moment, as the rogue cultivator's emotions became unstable, it collapsed to the bottom, and the speed and scale of its collapse began to increase rapidly. Chapter 22:33. Whether it was for living beings, or physical bodies, or even for heaven, earth, world, or space-time, there were endless benefits to being reborn. There were many kinds of benefits, but the most direct one was to be reborn and break through the congenital shackles, greatly increasing one's potential and giving one the foundation to achieve higher achievements. It was clearly the same for the world group in front of them. From the perspective of the world group, the many rogue cultivators, whether they were ordinary members or those who had established civilizations, become the rulers of civilizations, and open up their own world group, could actually be considered as experts with congenital deficiencies. From the perspective of the world group, the creation energy was the nourishment for their own growth. It was equivalent to a lot of nutrients that an ordinary person absorbed as he grew up. As a result, no matter how many Genesis energy the rogue cultivators possessed, it was impossible for them to absorb Genesis energy limitlessly and establish their own world group in one go when they were establishing their own world group. They could only rely on waves of creation energy intermittently to make the world group grow bit by bit in a state of hunger. This was equivalent to a baby's mother not being able to provide enough nutrition for it to grow. She would starve it for 3 days at a time. How could the baby not be born with a congenital deficiency? It was precisely because of this that although the world group of the rogue cultivators had been opened up, the world group created by any rogue cultivator, even the strongest one, was much weaker than the world group created by any of the Tao Masters in the domain of the Tao Masters. To make up for this congenital deficiency, the only choice was to be reborn. The benefits corresponded to the difficulty. If rebirth could bring so many benefits, the difficulty would obviously not be easy. For ordinary creatures, if they wanted to be reborn, They would need to cultivate some kind of exquisite cultivation method and use all kinds of resources to break the original balance and structure of their bodies. Then, they would need to go through some kind of extremely mysterious transformation to re-establish the balance and structure. In the end, they would achieve the effect of being reborn. If it was already so difficult for ordinary living beings, to be reborn in a world group was billions of times more difficult than for a living being. How could he succeed so easily? Clearly, the master of this world cluster had borrowed the power of the sublimation of his own world cluster to break the balance and structure of the world cluster, before using the power of creation to re-establish balance and structure, allowing the world cluster to be reborn. If Luo Fan wasn't here, his plan would have a high chance of succeeding. This was not because Luo Fan did not want the world group to be reborn and would definitely stop it. Instead, it was because in the process of rebirth, the old balance and structure would be broken, and a new balance and structure would not be established for the time being. That was when it was at its weakest. At this time, any movement could bring great damage to the world cluster, and the entire process of rebirth would be ruined. Clearly, although Luo Fan had no intention of interrupting the process of rebirth, he had directly brushed away all the appearances of the world cluster and directly observed the mysterious process at the core of the world cluster. This had already disturbed the fragile resistance of the world cluster and directly interrupted the process of rebirth. What a pity! Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh after realizing what was going on. At this moment, the two layers of the huge formation had completely collapsed. At first, it was just a collapsed tributary, but at this time, it was as if its fundamental structure had collapsed, and the collapse began to spread to all the other tributaries. All sorts of earth-shattering sounds rang out in the void. Majestic creation energy was released from the tributaries and quickly spread to the void, filling up the absolute void that originally had no creation energy. Due to the fact that there wasn't any creation energy in the surroundings, not only did the creation energy not encounter any resistance, but also seemed to be pushed by the void's thirst for the creation energy. The speed at which the creation energy spread was several times greater than the pressure from the river of creation. From afar, it looked like a large cloud of mist was frantically spreading in all directions, devouring the void in a frenzy. "Hurry up and enter the world cluster," a ruler yelled at this moment, as he said that the power of his world cluster spread out and enveloped the itinerant cultivators around him as much as possible, helping them withstand the boundless creation energy that was flying towards them from all directions. The roar made the itinerant cultivators and rulers come to a sudden realization. They immediately abandoned the originally collapsed formation and quickly huddled together. They huddled together with the ruler of the world cluster as the center. Fortunately, the itinerant cultivators had mostly huddled together with the civilization as the center. At this time, there was no conflict about who they should rely on, who they could not rely on, or who was under too much pressure, or who was not under too much pressure. No, it was not that all itinerant cultivators did not have such conflicts. There was a camp of tens of thousands of itinerant cultivators that had already fallen into chaos. That camp was the itinerant cultivator under the ruler who led the last operation to pluck the peaches. Don't forget, at this moment, that ruler's body had already collapsed due to the backlash of the formation. It was unknown if he had died or something else, but he did not appear in this position. Without that legitimate ruler to rely on, the itinerant cultivators naturally fell into chaos. They could not unify their opinions and were at a loss as to which ruler to rely on, or rather, which ruler would accept them. If things were not so urgent, they could still think calmly or even discuss calmly. This kind of chaos was naturally nothing, and they could quickly find a ruler who was willing to accept them through discussion and probing. But clearly, this was not the time for them to calmly discuss and probe. At this moment, the rulers were all extremely anxious. They were even worried about whether their world might be able to withstand the boundless power of creation. Even if they wanted to include the independent cultivators under their rule and their protection, they were already having a hard time doing so. How could they have the mood to care about the itinerant cultivators who were not their subordinates? Therefore, seeing that the itinerant cultivators were about to be completely drowned by the Genesis energy, an indescribable despair appeared in the eyes of the itinerant cultivators. They instinctively charged in all directions, wanting to sink into the protection circle of a ruler. However, the protection circle was not close to them. After all, even from a macro perspective, the rulers were closely connected to each other. They formed a huge formation and seemed to be extremely close to each other. But that was only from a macro perspective. In reality, the distance between the various camps was at least calculated in light years. Such a distance was enough to become a natural moat in the eyes of the itinerant cultivators at this critical moment. Most of them could not reach the camp of another ruler in time. Even a few lucky itinerant cultivators with faster reflexes and speed could travel a long distance in an extremely short period of time and reach the camp of another ruler. However, they could not enter the camp at all. They were directly intercepted by the power of the world cluster released by the ruler. They were forcefully blocked by the power of the world cluster released by the ruler as the Genesis energy. That was to be expected. After all, the rulers had unleashed the might of such a world swarm to intercept the power of creation that they believed would bring them endless danger and could even devour all of them. Under such circumstances, how could they not activate the defense and isolation power of the world cluster to the extreme? How could the itinerant cultivators, who could not withstand the Genesis energy, break through the defense that was activated to the extreme? What was so strange about such a performance? No, the itinerant cultivators were completely enveloped by the Genesis energy amidst their cries of agony. In the end, they fell into an endless cycle of life and death. Damn it! At this moment, the power of the world cluster appeared out of nowhere in the Genesis energy. The camp where the leader had disappeared and all the itinerant cultivators were enveloped by the Genesis energy appeared. A cultivator appeared in the void along with the power of the world cluster. From the looks of it, it was the leader whose body had collapsed earlier. Looking at the elite cultivators under him being continuously destroyed by the Genesis energy, the ruler's expression became even more unsightly. I'm still a step too late. The thought flashed across his mind with a hint of regret in his eyes. Even though he was already here and possessed enough world might to protect the elite rogue cultivators under him, he still couldn't do anything about it. However, he did not dare to do so at this moment. This was because the itinerant cultivators had already been infiltrated by the Genesis energy. They were already in the process of adapting to the Genesis energy. Under such circumstances, if he were to protect them and separate them from the Genesis energy, then not only would he not be able to protect their lives, but he would also end up killing them. This had actually happened many times over the years. In the past, there were cultivators who had made preparations before entering the river of creation, so that when the fellow Taoists outside saw that they could not withstand the Genesis energy, they would pull them out of the river of creation. At that time, the itinerant cultivator's performance in the river of creation was extremely tragic. The fellow Taoists outside could not bear to watch, so they followed his instructions and forcefully pulled him out of the river of creation. However, at that moment, an incomparably tragic thing happened. The Genesis energy that still existed in the itinerant cultivator's body completely corroded him. All traces of his existence were completely erased, and the itinerant cultivator's body and soul were directly destroyed from then on. Everyone understood that once they entered the Genesis energy and began to endure the test of the Genesis energy, they would start to adapt to the process of the Genesis energy. At that point, there would be no way back, and they could only continue forward. There were many studies as to why this was the case. The most reliable theory was that when a cultivator entered the Genesis energy, their body and mind would establish a strange balance because of the Genesis energy. The power of creation that seeped into a cultivator's body would quickly corrode and destroy the cultivator, while the power of creation outside would continuously repair the corroded and destroyed body and mind, thus forming a complete illusion, forming a miraculous balance. In such a balance, Both internal and external powers of creation were indispensable. If any one of them was missing, the cultivator would definitely be doomed. Under such circumstances, pulling the cultivator out of the power of creation was equivalent to taking away the power of creation from the outside. This naturally destroyed the balance, and the cultivator would naturally be completely corroded by the power of creation in the body. In the midst of regret, the ruler's eyes flashed, and he looked in a direction that almost all the cultivators did not dare to look at. The direction where the projection of the world cluster was originally located. The direction where Luo Fan was. At this moment, the figure that seemed to envelop the entire world was still hovering there. The endless Genesis energy around him kept surging and attacking, but it did not affect him at all. He stood there quietly with a calm and peaceful expression, as if the extremely tragic scene around him did not exist at all. Looking at the figure, the ruler's body trembled slightly, and a look of horror and panic appeared in his eyes. "Your Excellency, what exactly do you want to do?" Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head and laughed. "What do I want to do? All of this was caused by you guys. What has it got to do with me? How is it unrelated to you? If you didn't attack my world cluster projection just now, how could this formation collapse? And how could the situation be this bad?" The ruler roared. Although he was extremely fearful, because of the tragic scenes around him that stimulated his soul, he was ready to throw caution to the wind. "Are you sure you can really succeed?" Luo Fan only smiled and raised his hand to point behind the ruler. The ruler was slightly startled. How could he not know what was behind him? Behind him was an incomparably long and huge Genesis River that spanned across the entire territory of the rogue cultivators. How huge was the Genesis River? Just any one of the billions of portals outside was enough for the rogue cultivators to gather and form a civilization. Needless to say, the scale of the civilization was huge. Facing such a huge existence, the tens of millions of tributaries that they had opened up previously were as insignificant as a strand of hair growing on a giant's body. When the time is right, we will naturally seal these tributaries and let the Genesis River close up again. The ruler gritted his teeth and said, "There's no point in lying to ourselves like this." Luo Fan only sighed. He took a step forward, and in the blink of an eye, he had already arrived in front of the rogue cultivator. At this moment, the power of the world cluster around the rogue cultivator finally reacted. It surged with all its might and rapidly crushed towards Luo Fan, trying to stop him from doing anything. However, it was a pity that this method was ultimately too slow. At this moment, Luo Fan had already reached out and placed his hand on the ruler's shoulder. As the hand landed on the ruler's shoulder, the ruler felt a monstrous might wash over him. Whether it was his body, power, world cluster, spirit, or life essence, everything was instantly washed over by the boundless might. As the might washed over him, the ruler felt all his power disappear. Even his connection with the world cluster was completely cut off. Since the world group was isolated, the power of the world group that he possessed naturally disappeared as well. How was this possible? I'm just a clone here. Why did I suddenly turn into my main body? At this moment, the ruler had an extremely shocked expression on his face. One must know that his main body had always been in his own world cluster. The one that left the world cluster and came here was only a clone that was formed under the support of the world cluster's power. Because of this, even though he looked like he was completely torn to pieces, as though he had died and his soul dispersed, he could still recover and reappear here. However, at this moment, he felt that the difference between his clone and his main body had been completely erased. This body that was originally just a clone had suddenly turned into his main body. As for what his main body looked like, since his connection with the world cluster had been completely cut off, he did not know at all. Naturally, he could not confirm what state he was in at this moment. This power is only a 10,000th of the final impact, Luo Fan said calmly. Even so, you're confident that you can withstand the final impact? Hearing this, the ruler's expression froze. He instinctively rejected the possibility that what he said was true. Impossible. According to the trend of the increase in power, the final impact can't reach the level of power you're releasing now. The words spoken under the impulse of fear are meaningless. Luo Fan just smiled and said. As he spoke, he waved his hand, and the power that had completely sealed the ruler disappeared. As the power disappeared, the ruler felt that he had re-established a connection with his world cluster. Chapter 2234. To the ruler's senses, the location of his world cluster, and even the entirety of the civilization he controlled, had been engulfed by the power of creation. From the moment his clone left his world cluster until now, he felt that only a few dozen breaths had passed. Normally, no matter how fast the creation energy spread, it would at most be a few light years away. How could it have spread to his world cluster that was billions of light years away? At this moment, the only thing he could think of was that the Almighty in front of him had used a technique that he did not understand. It was this method that he did not understand that allowed the boundless power of creation to spread to the location of his world cluster billions of light years away in such a short time. It seems that although you have condensed your own world cluster, your understanding of the power of creation is still limited to the surface. Luo Fan just sighed at this time. In fact, he did not do anything else just now. The reason why the ruler felt that it was unbelievable that the creation energy had spread to such a vast area in just a few dozen breaths was that to him, only a few dozen breaths had passed. However, to the outside world, to the creation energy itself, and even to the entire independent cultivator domain, several years had passed. The reason for this was very simple. That was because Luo Fan had disrupted the connection between the ruler and the surrounding void at that moment. He had disrupted the ruler's perception of time, which was originally of the same origin, causing him to instinctively search for his own time coordinates from the surrounding power of creation. To the surrounding creation energy, time was merely one of its attributes. In fact, it was merely a variable. In this way, the time coordinates inside the power of creation were completely random. It had no connection with the time in the outside world, in the territory of the rogue cultivators. The ruler determined that only a few dozen breaths had passed by using the time coordinates in the surrounding creation energy. However, in reality, several years had passed in the independent cultivator domain. Aren't you afraid of the Tao Master's prison? The ruler looked at Luo Fan with a horrified look in his eyes and said through gritted teeth. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "The Tao Master's prison? What I'm doing now doesn't violate any of the basic rules of the Tao Master's path. How could the Tao Master's prison find me? You killed 90% of the practitioners in the individual cultivator area. Is this still in line with the basic rules of the Tao Master's path?" The ruler was obviously very dissatisfied. Luo Fan shook his head and laughed. Since when did you think that the path to becoming a Tao Master would care about your life and death? For the path of Tao Master, you, or we, are just some insignificant parasites in a certain period of its long history. No matter how many of you I kill, what loss is there to it? On the contrary, if I kill more of them, I might get some unexpected benefits on the road to becoming a Tao Master. It's fine that it didn't reward me, but how could it come to deal with me? His words caused the ruler's face to turn pale. He wanted to stubbornly refute Luo Fan's words, but his rationality told him that what Luo Fan said was true. For the Tao Master's path, the lives of the individual cultivators, and even the disciples of the Tao Master, did not matter. Even if all the individual cultivators were killed, the Tao Master's path would not blame him, let alone the fact that the individual cultivators' lives were unknown. Unless the person in front of him came from a higher level. At this thought, his eyes lit up and he thought of an idea. He immediately sneered and said, "Then let me see if you really have the confidence to do so. Descend, power of the Tao Master's prison." At this moment, the backup plan that he had prepared was suddenly activated. As his backup plan was activated, the power of the Tao Master's prison descended from the sky and landed directly on him. It wrapped around his body and began to sweep in all directions, instantly wrapping around Luo Fan. I was almost fooled by you. If you were really a cultivator from the 4th level, the Tao Master's prison would naturally not be activated because of what you did. However, you're a cultivator from a higher level who came from a higher level. That is against the rules of the Tao Master's path. As long as the Tao Master's prison discovers your existence, you will never be able to hide. As for your actions of slaughtering so many rogue cultivators, you will definitely be punished later on. Come, let's enter the Tao Master's prison together. Based on my previous mistakes, I will at most be locked up for a few 100 million years. However, you will definitely be thrown into the deepest abyss, or even never to be reincarnated. The ruler laughed. Hearing this, Luo Fan was stunned, then looked at the ruler sympathetically and said, "When did I say that I came from a higher level who went against the rules?" As he spoke, the power of the Tao Lord's purgatory swept past him, as if his body was nothing more than an illusion, or as if the power of the Tao Lord's purgatory was nothing more than an illusion. At this moment, the ruler sensed a scream coming from the depths of the power of creation, the power of the Tao Master's prison. Who activated the power of the Tao Master's prison? I have already completely restrained myself. As the cries rang out, waves of fluctuations came from all directions. Then, his figure gradually disappeared. He was enveloped by the power of the Tao Master's prison and was thrown into the depths of the Tao Master's prison. How is this possible? If he's so powerful, how can he not be from a higher level? Even a disciple of a Tao Master can't reach this level. Is this really the level that a cultivator from the 4th level can reach? At this moment, he completely disregarded the power of the Tao Master's prison and just muttered with a look of disbelief, then gradually disappeared without a trace. What a pity. If this person was sucked into the Cosmos group, it would definitely cause a storm. Watching the ruler's figure gradually being thrown into the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan could not help but sigh, a look of regret on his face. For this person to be able to cause such a huge storm in such a short period of time as an independent cultivator, and even persuade tens of millions of other rulers to act with him. Of course, this was partly because his ability to sublimate from the Cosmos group was extremely suitable for this operation, but more importantly, his leadership and leadership ability had reached a shocking level. With such leadership and leadership ability, he would definitely be able to stand out in a Cosmos group. In the end, he might even be able to trigger a large-scale war in the entire Cosmos group, causing many Cosmos group to undergo drastic changes. For Luo Fan, the changes in the Cosmos group were his cultivation method in the 4th level. The greater the change, the greater the possibility of his cultivation progress in the 4th level. Therefore, how could he not feel that it was a pity that the ruler was thrown into the Tao Master's prison? The ruler did not care about the consequences of activating the power of the Tao Master's prison and how many independent cultivators were thrown into the Tao Master's prison. But Luo Fan was completely different from him. To Luo Fan, these countless independent cultivators represented an endless supply of resources. If an independent cultivator was thrown into the Tao Master's prison, it meant that he lacked the cultivation resources that the independent cultivator could bring him. Therefore, how could he not care about these independent cultivators? At this moment, he swept his gaze across and saw all the independent cultivators who were trapped in the Tao Master's prison. Most of the independent cultivators were rulers of their respective civilizations. The fact that these rulers could stand out among the many independent cultivators meant that they had done much more than the other independent cultivators. The more they did, the more likely they were to violate the rules of the Tao Master's path, and the greater the commotion they caused after being discovered by the Tao Master's prison. Although it's a pity, it still saves me a lot of trouble. Seeing the rulers disappear under the power of the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan felt a sense of regret, mixed with a trace of satisfaction. It was a pity that the rulers were thrown into the prison, causing him to lose the cultivation resources that they could have brought him. On the other hand, he was satisfied that their departure would cause their world group to dissipate. This also meant that the independent cultivators who were originally attached to their world group could only face the creation energy head-on. They could be directly pulled into the Tao Master's domain, where they could create their own world group and connect with his world group. Their main bodies would be pulled into the world group and help his world group evolve, just like the independent cultivators under the Tao Master's tutelage. At this moment, as the rulers were pulled into the Tao Master's prison, their world group began to destabilize. The heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time gradually dispersed before being devoured by the surrounding creation energy and turned into creation energy again. The independent cultivators who relied on the world group's defenses to survive in the boundless creation energy were all horrified. All sorts of expressions of fear, anger, bewilderment, despair, or desperation appeared on their faces. In the end, they were all pulled into the creation energy with all sorts of complicated emotions and began the endless cycle of life and death that ordinary cultivators experienced. After several years of development, the entire river of creation had completely collapsed. The endless creation energy that existed within it had already broken free from the restrictions of the river of creation and spread across the entire independent cultivator domain, filling every inch of the independent cultivator domain with the boundless creation energy. However, the further one was from the source of the river of creation, which was the fist-sized hole that connected to the Tao Master's domain, the lower the concentration of creation energy. Of course, this was only relatively speaking. Even the lowest concentration of the Genesis energy was still many times stronger than the concentration that an ordinary independent cultivator could easily resist. The reason why it had developed to this stage in the past few years was very simple. It was because Luo Fan had not maintained the formation that maintained the stability of the river of creation all these years. After all, the river of creation was a long river filled with endless creation energy. The pressure from the power of creation had reached an unimaginable level. Even just a little bit of that pressure was enough to make any independent cultivator on the 4th level exhaust all their means to resist it. Moreover, the river of creation was endless, so it was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to resist it. Even if this formation had fused with all of Luo Fan's comprehensions of the world group and all of his cultivation achievements, it was still an extremely difficult task to completely withstand it with just a formation. The reason why the formation had been able to stabilize and allow the river of creation to exist was because Luo Fan was guarding the source of the river of creation, because he was instinctively adjusting the formation at all times, and also adjusting the river of creation. Otherwise, what was the point of him projecting a clone at the source of the river of creation? Was it just to capture the independent cultivators that sank into the river of creation? Previously, after the independent cultivators destroyed the formation, he had already made a decision to give up on maintaining the formation and adjusting the river of creation. He allowed the independent cultivator domain and the Tao Master's domain to interact with each other through the fist-sized hole. As a result, the formation that restricted the river of creation collapsed at an unimaginable speed through the hole created by the rulers. In just a few days, the formation on the surface of the river of creation had completely collapsed, causing the endless creation power within the river of creation to leak out in all directions without any restrictions after that. It took a few more years for the boundless space within the rogue cultivator's territory to be filled with the power of creation. There is no need to mention how desperate, regretful, angry, cursed, and begged the independent cultivators during this process. Only the final result made Luo Fan slightly satisfied. The channel has widened? Suddenly, Luo Fan furrowed his brows and narrowed his eyes. There seemed to be 2 rays of light that pierced through the barrier of the endless creation power and saw the original source of the river of creation, the channel that connected the independent cultivator domain and the Tao Master's domain. Compared to before, that passageway was a little bigger. This change surprised Luo Fan. With a thought, his figure instantly tore through the barrier of the endless creation power and came to the side of the channel. When he came here, he carefully sensed and found that as the endless creation power continuously surged out of the channel, the edge of the channel was being worn away at an extremely slow speed. Faintly, he was even able to see countless complicated and indescribable talisman markings, lines, words, and even various lights and shadows that couldn't be described with words. All of this, under the scouring of the creation power, turned into bits of debris that constantly broke away, integrated into the creation power, and disappeared without a trace. It could be worn away. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan lost his original composure. Faintly, there seemed to be light shining from his eyes. The reason why this channel existed was actually because he had used various methods to fuse the channel between the Tao Master's domain and the Rogue Cultivator's domain. As for why the countless small channels that originally existed could only allow wisps of creation power to seep in, but now that they were fused together, they could support the huge and long river of creation. The reason was naturally even simpler. It was nothing more than an environment that Luo Fan's main body had created in the Tao Master's domain, an environment that was thousands of times denser than an ordinary environment. In other words, it seemed that Luo Fan had easily broken the barrier between the two domains. But in fact, he couldn't do anything about the barrier at all. It was precisely because of this that he was so shocked when he found that the barrier was actually melting under the scouring of the creation power. At this moment, he completely forgot about the many rogue cultivators in the rogue cultivator's domain and focused on the channel, on the way the creation power worked on the barrier. For existences at their level, there was absolutely no change in the universe that couldn't be reproduced. There was no pattern that couldn't be summarized. What happened in the channel in front of him, the erosion of the creation power on the barrier, was at most a surprise, an accident, or even a miracle in the eyes of ordinary living beings. It was impossible to study and summarize it at all. However, in Luo Fan's eyes, it was a key to understand the barrier. At this moment, he activated his perception. His boundless perception wrapped around the surroundings of the passageway, delving into every point of contact between the edges of the passageway and the power of creation. He absorbed the reaction between the power of creation and every point into his heart. The creation power was a power that the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy condensed together in an extremely strange way and transformed into a form of power. This power naturally didn't have any basic units, nor did it have anything like the so-called creation power particles. No matter how deep he went, no matter how many times he magnified his vision, the creation power was still the creation power, and it looked no different from a macroscopic view. Obviously, although the barrier was more stable than the creation power, it ultimately didn't have the characteristics of the creation power. As Luo Fan's vision went deeper, the appearance of the barrier changed. In the beginning, it was just a faintly discernible layer of thin film. As he went deeper, it turned into countless runes, lines, words, patterns, and even strange lights and shadows. As he went deeper, it turned into the illusory images of many worlds, the illusory images of many parts of heaven and earth. Chapter 22:35. In this manner, layer after layer, layer after layer, the number of layers finally reached a level that was beyond anyone's imagination. It felt as if it had almost exceeded the limit of numerical description. It was faintly approaching the limit of Luo Fan's sensing ability. As Luo Fan's observation continued to delve deeper into the microscopic level, the complex and mysterious structure of the barrier became clearer and clearer in his eyes. Unfortunately, the reason behind it was still too high for his level. Even though he had seen it more and more clearly, he still couldn't understand it. He didn't even understand how the barrier worked and how it could forcibly separate the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain in such a way. However, it wasn't completely useless for him to go deeper. In the process of such a deep observation, the details of the interaction between the creation power and the barrier were constantly refined as he went deeper. Originally, he could only see the process of the friction between the creation power and the barrier from a macroscopic perspective, but it gradually turned into more indescribable details. The interaction between the talismans and the creation power was constantly reflected in his eyes and sank into his heart. It's not this. It's not this. As he delved deeper into the microscopic level, Luo Fan speculated and compared, looking for the factor that caused the barrier to consume the creation power. As he continued to delve deeper into the microscopic level, he eliminated more and more factors. In the end, when his in-depth observation was close to the limit of his sensing ability, that was to say, the level of in-depth observation had reached, or even almost reached the limit that could be described by numbers, he finally found what he was looking for. When the power of creation came into contact with the extremely deep barrier, strands of it fused with some extremely tiny runes within it. This fusion was different from the previous fusion of so many layers. There were talismans in the previous layers that also fused with the creation power, but that kind of fusion didn't last long. Once it was fused, it would quickly separate again. After that, whether it was the creation power or the talismans, there was no change. It was as if that kind of fusion had never happened. But now, the situation of this fusion was completely different. The current fusion was a kind of fusion that could no longer be separated. In this fusion, not only did the creation power change, but the talismans also became completely different from before. It was this difference that destroyed the integrity of the barrier. As a result, a small portion of the barrier connected to the rune was repelled by the barrier and separated from it. This was the root cause of the countless fine fragments falling from the barrier. After discovering this, all the problems were solved for Luo Fan. Just like in the secular world, if a scientist discovered a certain principle of change, he would soon be able to use this principle to invent a variety of tools that operated according to this principle, which would be of great or small use in a certain aspect. Now that Luo Fan had discovered the principle of the change that allowed the barrier to fall a little, more inspiration emerged in his heart. Instinctively, one divine ability after another emerged from the bottom of his heart. These techniques were none other than techniques that were specifically designed to destroy the barrier. If any one of them were to be used, it would be able to increase the rate at which the Genesis energy wore down the barrier by tens of millions of times. However, it was obvious that an increase of a few million times was not something that Luo Fan was willing to accept. It must be known that although tens of millions of times was shocking, but if the base was small to a certain extent, then such a multiplication would be meaningless. Evidently, with the original speed at which the Genesis energy wore down the barrier, even if it was tens of millions of times faster, it would still be nothing to him. Fortunately, these techniques were only instinctively thought of by him, and they had not been refined or developed in depth. Clearly, there was still a huge potential that could be unearthed. At that moment, countless profound truths began to flow through his heart. The profundities of his worldview, the profundities of concept techniques, and even the various powers contained in his group of worlds all surged out from the depths of his memories like a mountain torrent and filled his entire mind. Along with the countless memories, countless truths, and countless mysteries, he began to modify the divine arts and techniques that had appeared out of instinct before. Every technique became more and more exquisite in the process, and the rate at which it wore down the barrier also became faster and faster. With his understanding of cultivation, as long as he willed it, he could make any kind of supernatural power incomparably exquisite. If he was willing to put in a lot of effort, it was not impossible for him to elevate one of the most ordinary techniques to a level that could shock the disciples of Tao masters. The techniques that were specially used to destroy the barrier were naturally no exception. With his hard work, in just a few days, he had obtained a powerful divine ability that was billions of times more powerful than the most powerful divine ability among the many divine abilities he had instinctively created back then. Although it's still a little slow, it's barely acceptable. Luo Fan sighed as he felt the magical ability that had emerged in his heart, which was close to perfection and could no longer be modified. As he sighed, his heart trembled slightly, and he raised his hand to slap the air beside him. As he slammed his palm down, the boundless Genesis energy in the surroundings seemed to be drawn in by a supreme force, and it began to rapidly gather in the direction of his palm. A mysterious and strange light formed in the center of the gathering of the Genesis energy. This light was extremely strange. It was a faint cyan color, and contained a sense of destruction that even surpassed the simple concept of destruction. It felt as if it was the sublimation of the concept of destruction, or rather, the sublimation of the concept of destruction. The cyan light began to expand wildly as the surrounding endless Genesis energy gathered. At first, it was only the size of a palm, but in the blink of an eye, it had already expanded to a radius of several meters. In the blink of an eye, it was already hundreds of meters, tens of thousands of meters. Waves of sound waves began to be born from the contact between the cyan light and the void. They piled up and spread in all directions, turning into a huge sound wave world in the blink of an eye. Countless runes, lines, patterns, and even other lights and shadows began to emerge from the cyan light. Then, the world cluster of sound waves continued to collapse and be born. The speed at which they were born was much faster than the speed at which they collapsed. The world cluster of sound waves was pushed by the newly born world cluster to surge in all directions. It was about to surpass the scale of all the world clusters in the rogue cultivator's territory. Under the cyan light, all kinds of strange lights and shadows kept appearing and disappearing from the center. In the end, at a certain moment, an aura that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with spread out from the center of the light and shadow. That was the aura of the Tao Master's domain. Back then, it took a lot of effort to create a fist-sized passage to the Tao Master's domain. But this time, with just a slap, he had created a huge passage that was several meters in radius. Moreover, this passage did not stop expanding after that. Instead, it continued to expand at an even faster speed in all directions, constantly expanding. It's finally completely opened. Seeing this, Luo Fan let out a long breath. When he created the god art, he had already set up a setting for it. This setting meant that once the god art appeared, it would not rest until the barrier was destroyed. Either the god art itself would disappear, or the barrier would disappear. As long as neither of the two was achieved, the foundation of the god art would frantically absorb the endless power of creation in the surroundings and turn it into its driving force, pushing it to continuously strengthen and expand. In other words, for the current Luo Fan, this god art no longer needed him to activate it. Now, even if he turned around and left, it would no longer affect the two domains recombining. Just as Luo Fan let out a breath, an inexplicable aura shrouded him. "What the hell did you do?" A slightly displeased voice entered his ears. This voice to him was a completely unfamiliar voice. Even if he instantly scanned the depths of his memory for any living being that could speak, he could not find the source of this voice, nor could he find the owner of this voice. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly became vigilant. He frowned and asked, "Who are you?" As he said that, the aura that had appeared out of nowhere and shrouded him shook slightly. It left his body and suddenly condensed in front of him, forming the figure of a middle-aged man. There was not a single detail on the middle-aged man's body that was not perfect. Every expression and every movement seemed to contain endless principles and mysteries. Even Luo Fan felt like the middle-aged man's imprint was about to form in the depths of his heart the moment he saw this man. Fortunately, he had experienced this imprint many times, so he had enough experience dealing with it. At this moment, an idea formed in his heart and turned into a sharp blade of wisdom. He slashed and completely destroyed the imprint that was gradually forming, causing his mind to become clear again. The middle-aged man did not care about this at all. At this moment, he only looked confused. He looked at Luo Fan and said, "Who I am is not important. What's important is, who are you? I originally thought you were only trying to benefit the independent cultivators, but now it seems that you have other plans. Tell me what you're doing." The middle-aged man did not look arrogant at all, but his expression and tone contained unimaginable pride. It was like a high and mighty god was facing a mortal that was crawling on the ground. This tone made Luo Fan frown. He said, "Sir, you must be an independent cultivator that came down from the 5th or 6th layer, right? You have such great power, and even went against the flow to come here so early, but you haven't done anything for the independent cultivators. Now you're blaming me, a person who has done a lot of things. It's ridiculous. He had absolute confidence in his guess of the middle-aged man's identity. After all, he was now an expert of the fifth tribulation who had gone through the fifth tribulation. Before he used the mysteries of the level, even an expert at the fifth layer of the road of Tao Master would not have any advantage in front of him. He could not be like this independent cultivator in front of him, whose aura alone was enough to make him feel wary. The fact that the independent cultivator in front of him was able to do this showed that his strength was strong. No matter how one looked at it, an existence with such strength could only exist on the fifth level or higher. Now, I'm the one asking you, the independent cultivator said indifferently. As he said this, a huge and unparalleled aura instantly shrouded Luo Fan. This aura was so mysterious that it seemed to contain the power of the world cluster. It also contained a deeper quality that belonged to the world view. Under this aura, the power of creation around Luo Fan's body began to distort wildly. Countless heavens and earth, countless worlds, countless spacetimes, infinite creatures, and infinite power crazily emerged. At every moment, there seemed to be countless cycles of life and death going on around his body. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that his body and mind were under an unimaginable pressure. His life essence was rattling at this moment, as if it could no longer bear the pressure and was about to collapse to a certain extent from the inside out. Although his worldview was extremely powerful and had amazing defensive capabilities, it was much stronger than the pressure that came from the aura. However, in terms of quantity, his worldview was still too small compared to the endless aura coming from the outside world. In this way, even though his worldview was able to protect his life essence from collapsing, it was only able to protect this point. It was difficult to protect his other aspects, let alone his body itself. Sensing this unimaginably terrifying aura, Luo Fan's eyes couldn't help but light up. For him now, as long as it didn't involve the attack of a higher level, it could not really threaten his life. Although the aura of this itinerant cultivator, who came from a higher level, was terrifying, it ultimately did not involve the attack of a higher level. This also meant that this aura, or even this powerhouse from a higher level, posed no threat to him at all. Since there was no threat, the more techniques this powerhouse displayed, the more mysterious power he displayed, the greater the revelation it would give him, and the more benefits it would bring him. Just like Senior Sister May, who had been summoned by the fourth senior brother in the domain of the Tao Master, he had met. How was Senior Sister May back then? Didn't she also display almost overwhelming strength at the beginning? But in the end, wasn't she subdued and completely sealed by his means? Thinking of Senior Sister May, Luo Fan began to compare the itinerant cultivator in front of him. He couldn't help but be a little disappointed by this comparison. Although the itinerant cultivator in front of him was powerful, there was still a slight gap between his methods and Senior Sister May's. As expected, the disciple of the Tao Master is the disciple of the Tao Master. It's too difficult for ordinary itinerant cultivators to surpass the inheritance of the Tao Master. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. At this moment, his body had already collapsed layer by layer under the pressure of the aura. The world group, triggered by the aura, frantically devoured the various parts of his body that had been crushed by the aura. It looked like layers of flesh were being scraped off his body. The scene was so tragic that it was enough to make a person with weak psychological endurance have nightmares. As expected of someone who dares to scheme against everyone, he can actually withstand this. The middle-aged itinerant cultivator said with a frown. As he said this, the aura emitted from his body became even more terrifying. The change in the aura naturally led to endless changes, causing the heaven and earth, worlds, space-time, and everything else around Luo Fan's body to suddenly expand by several times. This caused the fragments of Luo Fan's body, which had been scraped off layer by layer, to suddenly accelerate by several times. In just a few short breaths, Luo Fan, who originally had a few kilograms of flesh, had turned into a skeleton. Regardless of what your goal is, you must first open up the world group of the itinerant cultivators and let their wills return to their bodies, the middle-aged cultivator said indifferently. This voice was like a god speaking on behalf of the heavens. It directly reverberated in Luo Fan's ears and even turned into a mysterious attack that pounced on his soul, wanting to shake his will. Where's your true body? At this moment, Luo Fan spoke. As he spoke, rays of spirit light burst out from within his body and completely shattered the sound waves that were invading his body and mind. Then, it completely crushed the aura that was crushing his body like it was scraping meat, turning his body into a skeleton. At this moment, an infinite world of sound waves was born and merged with the world of sound waves, which was still spreading and connecting the domain of the Row cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master. The speed at which the world of sound waves spread became faster and faster, and the scale also became larger and larger. The heaven and earth, worlds, space-time, and everything else that were born because of the aura were continuously crushed by the spirit light and turned back into the power of creation. They were devoured by the endless power of creation and disappeared without a trace. Chapter 2236. At this moment, the spiritual light that surged out of Luo Fan's body brazenly crushed all the worlds triggered by the aura. Then, it passed through the creation power to the middle-aged cultivator and pressed down on him. This spiritual light contained endless principles and mysteries, and its structure vaguely felt like the barrier that separated the independent cultivator's domain from the Tao Master's domain. Of course, after all, he couldn't fully understand the mysteries contained in the barrier, so the feeling of the barrier that he created at this moment was extremely superficial and belonged to a small part that he could understand. Moreover, even though it was only a small portion, he had forcefully used a power that was tens of thousands of times greater than the barrier to forcefully construct it with such a difficult method. The final effect was naturally beyond imagination. The huge and unparalleled aura seemed so fragile under the mysterious spiritual light that it was easily crushed. And the many worlds that were born because of this aura also seemed so fragile under the spiritual light, unable to resist at all. Even the projection of the cultivator in the higher realm seemed to be unable to withstand this spiritual light. That's all. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator sneered. Along with this sneer, he suddenly raised his hand and waved it in the air. A strange wave was generated out of thin air and directly swept through the terrifying spiritual light that was pressing down on him from all directions. Immediately afterward, the spiritual light collapsed and turned into countless fragments that were completely devoured by the boundless power of creation in the surroundings, disappearing without a trace. It's an attack that directly targets the structure of the barrier. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes lit up, and this thought flashed through his mind. In terms of power and power alone, that wave was tens of thousands of times weaker than the spiritual light that he released. But it was this power that was tens of thousands of times weaker than the spiritual light that he released that was directly penetrating all the defenses of his spiritual light and penetrating the most fundamental structure of the spiritual light. It forcibly disintegrated the parts of the structure that he comprehended from the barrier that made the spiritual light so powerful, causing the spiritual light to completely collapse. There was only one possibility in this situation. That was, the cultivator in front of him had studied the barrier that separated the Tao Master's domain from the Row cultivator's domain by many times more than him. So, he went against the flow to come here to study this barrier. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had a flash of inspiration, and this thought flashed through his mind. As for why the middle-aged cultivator was researching this barrier, whether it was to break it or simply for his own cultivation, he didn't even need to think about it to know the answer. The other party was definitely researching this barrier for his own cultivation. If it was for the sake of breaking this barrier, with his research, he would have been able to do what Luo Fan was doing at some point in time. Not to mention, after Luo Fan constructed the long river of creation, He also had countless opportunities to sense the encounters of the many rogue cultivators in the Dao Master's domain. If he really wanted to break this barrier for the sake of the many rogue cultivators, how could he not have paid attention to them for such a long time? It wasn't until now, when Luo Fan completely disintegrated the foundation of the barrier, that the middle-aged cultivator would completely collapse with the passage of time, that the middle-aged cultivator used the experiences of the many rogue cultivators as an excuse to come to him. That's right. Now, Luo Fan clearly knew that the reason that the middle-aged cultivator gave him before was just an excuse. Moreover, it was the kind of excuse that had almost no sincerity at all, and he didn't even have the intention to make Luo Fan believe it. So, what does he want to achieve? Does he want to obtain the method that I used to break this barrier? Or is he simply venting his anger? Or does he have a deeper intention? All sorts of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he couldn't help but frown slightly. At that moment, the middle-aged cultivator made his move again. He grabbed out with his hand, and the creation power in the void began to surge rapidly, as if it was being grabbed by an invisible giant hand, and began to knead in a strange manner. In the blink of an eye, a huge seal appeared in front of him. The seal wasn't huge, and it was at most the size of a person. It appeared among the creation power, and naturally produced an indescribable aura. Under this aura, the endless creation power in the surroundings was like a subject facing an emperor, and it naturally submitted. Even the way it operated began to change. From the original wanton, surging in all directions, it began to circulate around the seal. In the blink of an eye, from Luo Fan's point of view, the surrounding power of creation within a huge range was gradually separated from the outside world, forming an independent and complete entity. It began to faintly reject all the power of creation from the outside world, and gradually sealed everything inside. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the domain of the Dao Master, suddenly felt that the connection between him and his doppelganger was greatly interfered with. This interference was even more powerful than the isolation between the doppelganger and the main body in the state of chaos. If he hadn't already had a higher perspective and could communicate with his doppelganger through other levels, he might have lost his doppelganger at this time, and let the doppelganger directly open up in the sealed area. What a wonderful manipulation method, as expected of an expert who came from a higher level who went against the flow. The way he used the creation power is really amazing. At this moment, both Luo Fan and his doppelganger had an inexplicable look of admiration on their faces. All along, when he entered the 4th level of the Dao Master's path, he seemed to have been successful. Whether it was the disciples of the Dao Master, the individual cultivators, or the disciples of the Dao Master who went against the flow from a higher level, they all lost to him. In fact, he had become the absolute ruler of the entire 4th level of the Dao Master's path, whether it was the Dao Master's domain or the individual cultivator's domain. However, from the beginning until now, his manipulation of the creation power, that was the dark chaotic power that filled the entire 4th level, had stopped at the level of letting it evolve naturally. Whether it was building his own world cluster or using the power of his own world cluster to influence the creation power, everything was in fact the result of the development of the creation power itself. From the beginning until now, he had never directly manipulated the power of creation to produce any sort of change. After all, the creation power, for the current him, was still too profound and mysterious. Even in the face of the barrier that covered the entire 4th level of the Dao Master's path and completely separated the domain of the individual cultivators from the Dao Master's domain, he was still able to observe and comprehend its structure by constantly delving deeper and deeper. However, even though he seemed to be able to isolate the creation power at will and use it to achieve the results he wanted, he still could not understand the structure of the creation power. Whether he used a macroscopic perspective or an extremely microscopic perspective, the creation power was still the creation power. Whatever it looked like now, it would still look the same after he changed his perspective. Such a performance obviously meant that the level of his use of the creation power was still at the level of the use of the appearance. Even if he had almost used the appearance of the appearance to the point where he could easily crush all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, the appearance was still the appearance and could not become the essence, let alone allow him to manipulate and sublimate the creation power like he did with other forces and sublimate other forces. At this moment, even though the technique that the middle-aged cultivator displayed was only using the appearance of the power of creation, he had at least directly manipulated the power of creation and changed the rules of operation of the power of creation. Compared to him, it was already closer to the essence of the creation power. Seeing this, how could Luo Fan not be tempted? How could he not be interested? At this moment, a faint smile appeared on the middle-aged cultivator's face, and he said, "In this case, you will no longer have any contact with the original body. Come on, let me see what secret you have to be able to surpass so many Tao Masters." As he spoke, his entire body seemed to begin to expand crazily. The originally extremely strong sense of existence began to expand crazily like a balloon. In just a few breaths, this sense of existence had increased to a level that even shocked Luo Fan. When it stabilized, Luo Fan suddenly understood. It turned out that there had never been any doppelganger projection. From the beginning, the cultivator in front of him was already the real body of the higher level rogue cultivator. The previous state of the doppelganger projection was just a simulation of the real body using some method that he still could not understand. At this time, the size of the middle-aged cultivator was no longer the extreme sense of expansion that it gave him when he changed. It was still the same size, but it had become more solid. The original illusory state had become the state of flesh and blood. As for the aura on his body, it had also surpassed a certain limit and had completely fused with the surrounding creation power. Although Luo Fan could still sense the boundless terror of this aura, he knew that this aura was many times stronger than when he simulated the state of the doppelganger projection. However, they did not cause any abnormalities in the surrounding creation power, nor did they cause any changes to the creation power, nor did any existences like the world clusters appear. This change made Luo Fan's heart move slightly, and he faintly had a subtle understanding. At this moment, the flow of the surrounding creation power that had been separated from the outside world began to change slightly. With this change, the flow of time inside began to accelerate crazily. In the blink of an eye, it made Luo Fan's doppelganger feel that the flow of time had increased from the same state as the original body to a terrifying degree that was billions of times faster than the original body's. In other words, a breath of time passed in the original body's place, and the time that the doppelganger had experienced would probably increase to billions of seconds. In other words, who knew how many billions of years had passed? So this is his goal. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that all of his previous questions had been answered. The middle-aged cultivator in front of him had never cared about the life and death of the independent cultivators on this level. Nor did he care about the relationship between the independent cultivators on this level and the disciples of the Tao Master. All he had ever cared about were the mysteries that interested him, or rather, the mysteries that could amaze him. And it was obvious that the mysteries that Luo Fan had displayed when he destroyed the barrier were what interested the middle-aged cultivator. Everything that the middle-aged cultivator had done was all for this moment. He wanted to control his doppelganger, and then use all means to dig out all of the doppelganger's secrets, and dig out the source of everything that he had done. After understanding all of this, he could not help but smile faintly. "I didn't expect you to have such a plan. You're indeed worthy of being an expert from higher level." At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator was no longer in a hurry. He looked at Luo Fan and said with a smile, "You flatter me. Are you going to take the initiative to reveal all of your secrets, or do I have to dig them out myself? Don't worry, there's no need to rush. We have plenty of time now." Cutting off the connection between me and my original body, and then accelerating the flow of time, making the time it takes for my original body to rush over infinitely long. This method is not very clever. Luo Fan sighed. Whether it's clever or not, it's enough. The middle-aged cultivator's expression was still calm, and he was not angry at all because of Luo Fan's disdain for his method. However, this method of directly controlling the creation energy is quite exquisite. Can you let me know how you did it? Luo Fan stirred up the power of creation around him and asked. At this moment, the surrounding creation energy did not seem any different from before at first glance. However, if one took a closer look, they would discover that every strand of it had undergone subtle changes compared to before. The way it evolved had vaguely leaned towards various directions. It could no longer maintain absolute fairness like before, and it could evolve into any space-time, any world, and any heaven and earth. Although he did not know what was going on, Luo Fan was certain that a large portion of the creation energy in the surroundings would not be able to manifest the heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time. At the very least, it was difficult to evolve the heaven and earth, world, and space-time that belonged to the world of laws. The middle-aged cultivator looked at Luo Fan with a hint of admiration in his eyes. You can still ask this calmly at a time like this. No wonder you have such strength at this stage. Luo Fan smiled and said, "It's not just me. Almost all the cultivators who can reach the 4th level have the same mentality." The middle-aged cultivator sneered and shook his head. "You've overestimated them. If they had this mentality, how could they have stayed on this level for such a long time without making any progress? No creation energy? That's not a reason at all. Even at the beginning, there was creation energy appearing at every moment in the rogue cultivator's territory. If they had the intention, they would have long researched a way to penetrate the barrier and communicate with the Tao Venerable's territories. But look at what they've done. They've stuck to their old ways. They've actually surrounded the source of creation energy and supervised each other so that no one can affect the source. If it weren't for you, would there be any difference between them now and before?" Luo Fan remained silent for a while. Indeed, although the middle-aged cultivator was a little extreme, his words were not too wrong. Even before he arrived, the rogue cultivator's territory also had a considerable number of sources of creation energy. Although these sources were small, they were still connected to the Tao Venerable's territories. If they were really bold, they could have used their own wisdom, power, or even the wisdom and power of many fellow Taoists to research and experiment on the source. Perhaps they could have done what Luo Fan had done countless years before Luo Fan arrived, expanding the source of creation energy and increasing the amount of creation energy that surged in by countless times. In the end, they could have changed the empty and lonely state of the rogue cultivator's territory. However, until Luo Fan arrived, the rogue cultivator's territory remained in the same state as when the barrier was first set up. There was a huge gap between the rogue cultivator's territory and the Tao Venerable's territories. Was it really just a problem with the Tao Venerable's territories? Were there really no problems with those rogue cultivators at all? The middle-aged cultivator's expression relaxed when he saw Luo Fan's silence. He smiled and said, "It's precisely because I've seen through them that I've never thought of helping them break the barrier, even though I've already figured out how to break it." Hearing this, Luo Fan laughed. "Why do you have to make it sound so noble? It's just that you haven't fully understood the mystery of the barrier, so you don't want it to disappear. How can there be so many reasons?" The middle-aged man's expression froze for a moment before he smiled and said, "That's naturally part of the reason. However, the reason I mentioned is also one of my considerations." Chapter 22:37. The middle-aged man sneered. He didn't make any movements, but the surrounding creation power under his control had already begun to riot. A seal condensed from the power of creation appeared in front of him. Then it suddenly moved as if it was an incomparably vast world. Accompanied by boundless momentum, it crazily pressed towards Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that everything about his clone in reality, whether it was his mind or consciousness, perception or instinct, and even his body, power, and everything else, was suppressed by an unimaginable power. At this moment, Luo Fan could only watch helplessly as the seal imprinted itself on his body. The speed of the seal had reached an unimaginable level. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived above his head and pressed down on it. Boom! With a loud sound, an earth-shattering explosion came from Luo Fan's body. Amidst the explosion, surging air waves gushed out from the pores all over his body, directly causing the surrounding Genesis energy to become chaotic. If it was in the outside world, such an impact would be enough to make the surrounding creation power give birth to countless worlds, and space-time. But here, where the middle-aged cultivator was completely controlling, such an impact did not have any effect. The creation power was still the creation power, and its nature did not change at all. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that everything inside his body was constantly undergoing earth-shattering explosions. This kind of explosion was so intense that it felt like every inch of his body was enough to completely tear his entire body apart. However, in the end, the power of the explosion did not leak out at all. It only messed up the insides of his body, causing his insides to gradually turn into a mass of chaos. However, it did not cause any changes to his body at all. It was as if there was an even more powerful force binding the surface of his body during the process of the earth-shattering explosion, maintaining his body from collapsing. At this moment, a misty feeling rose from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart. The light and shadow in front of him constantly changed, twisting into various abstract landscapes that could not be described with words. You want to confuse my mind? At this moment, Luo Fan understood what was going on through the senses of his main body outside. At this moment, his main body could clearly see through the connection on other levels that in the independent domain of creation power created by the middle-aged cultivator, the seal was releasing infinite power and stirring up all the structures in his body. Whether it was the structure of space-time, the structure of consciousness, the structure of the soul, or even the essence of his life, they were all shaken by the impact like catkins in the wind. At the same time, as his body was in chaos, a kind of mysterious, indistinct power wrapped around his origin of life. It continued to outline and build around his origin of life, as if it wanted to form an incomparably profound structure to achieve some purpose. Combined with the senses of his doppelganger, he could clearly know that the source of the power that made him fall into confusion and isolated him from the surroundings came from the mysterious structure that wrapped around his life origin. In that structure, Luo Fan could sense an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Among them, there was a bit of the aura that belonged to the barrier that isolated the domain of the individual cultivators and the domain of the Tao Master. Of course, compared to the barrier, this layer of structure lacked that kind of natural feeling and had a lot more smoke and fire. If the real barrier was said to be the naturally born stars in the universe, then the structure in front of him was just like the starry sky drawn by a naughty child on a piece of paper. The disparity between the two was unimaginably large. However, it was precisely because of such a huge gap that Luo Fan finally felt as if he was facing the real barrier and had no way to comprehend its mystery. In the face of this structure that was constantly being built, he finally grasped its traces and found the thread to comprehend its fundamental mystery. I see. This barrier actually contains so many mysteries. Not only does it contain the mystery of the fourth layer of the world group, but it also contains the essence of the third layer of the Tao Foundation, the characteristics of the many strange scenes in the second layer, the vastness of the grand rules of heaven and earth in the first layer, and even a variety of exquisite principles that are unknown to the higher-level people. It really is all-inclusive and contains everything. Taking advantage of the opportunity of the rapid creation of the structure, Luo Fan tried his best to absorb its secrets and understand the many principles contained in it. The structure contained almost all the mysteries that Luo Fan had previously comprehended in the Tao Master's path, whether it was the first, second, third, or fourth layer. Moreover, this inclusion was not a simple stacking. Instead, it was ingeniously combined in an unimaginable and mysterious way. Layer upon layer, layer upon layer, place upon place. Every mystery was in the most suitable and needed position. In the end, it formed an incomparably complete and could even be called a perfect whole. Of course, this combination could be said to be truly perfect on the barrier. It was so perfect that Luo Fan could not find any traces of it, or even to the extent that he could not discover its combination at all. However, in front of him, the structure that was constantly outlined and constructed around the life origin of the doppelganger was still very far from being perfect. The combination of the various principles and mysteries was still very artificial, so Luo Fan only needed to sense it slightly to distinguish each of them. Although Luo Fan dared not say that he had surpassed all cultivators with his understanding of the previous few layers and the fourth layer, at least in the same layer, he was at least confident that no one could compare to him. Previously, when he did not know the foundation of the barrier, because he could not find the direction to comprehend it, he naturally could not understand the structure of the barrier. However, after being reminded by the other party and knowing the direction, he felt like he had opened the door to a new world. He only felt endless inspiration and endless information crazily pouring into his heart, making him feel that his understanding of the barrier was deepening at every moment, and he felt that his understanding of the mysterious principles of the previous layers was becoming more profound. After just a short while, he had absolute confidence that he could release a spiritual light that was tens of thousands of times more powerful than before. It must be said that the spiritual light that contained the mysteries of the barrier was something that he had expended a lot of effort to comprehend. He had relied on his near-limitlessly deep understanding of the microscopic world to slightly comprehend it. Now, with just this single comprehension, he had already surpassed all of his previous comprehensions by who knew how much. It was evident how great his progress was. At this moment, Luo Fan's main body actually still existed in the domain of the Tao Lord, and he was still within his own world cluster. He did not rush toward the location of the doppelganger, as the middle-aged cultivator thought he would. However, this was extremely convenient for what he wanted to do now. At this moment, he swept his gaze and instantly locked onto a certain part of the void. As his perspective rapidly changed, that part of the void was constantly magnified, and the secret hidden in the depths of the void was gradually revealed. In the end, after magnifying it by who knows how many billions of times, he finally saw the secret hidden behind the void. It was a barrier that filled the entire domain of the Tao Lord and completely separated the domain of the independent cultivators. It was a barrier that was set up by the powerhouses under the tutelage of the Tao Lord of a higher level. Fortunately, he was in his own world cluster and not somewhere else, where he was surrounded by the boundless creation energy. If he wanted to do this while he was surrounded by the creation energy, he would have to first get rid of the huge interference of the creation energy before he could truly see the barrier. And this would require at least a large amount of his energy. At this moment, the barrier was rapidly collapsing. The location of the collapse was where his doppelganger was, which was also the source of the long river of creation, and also the location of the passageway that connected to the ball of power on his palm. If one were to think about it logically, the location of the barrier should correspond to where Luo Fan was at this moment, which is also the interior of his world cluster. However, it was clear that the creation energy could not be deduced with logic that ordinary living beings could understand. At this moment, the location where the barrier was broken was not where Luo Fan was, but outside his world cluster. In fact, it was in a very ordinary part of the void outside the incomparably huge vortex of creation energy around Luo Fan's world cluster. It was as if the passageway that was surging with the creation energy was not the same as the passageway that was created when the barrier was broken, even though the place where the barrier was broken seemed to be formed after the passageway collapsed and spread. At this moment, if Luo Fan looked out, he would see that in a place extremely far away from the vortex of creation energy that was filled with tens of millions of worlds, endless strands of strange power that were fused with the creation energy were constantly gathering somewhere. And as the power gathered, the passageway that led to the independent cultivator's domain also constantly fused, creating an increasingly large passageway that connected to the independent cultivator's domain. With the birth of the passageway, endless creation energy continuously poured into the independent cultivator's domain through the passageway, causing the concentration of the creation energy in the independent cultivator's domain to become thicker and thicker as time passed. It also caused the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain to start thinning with the passageway as the center. Although, because it had only appeared for a short time, the concentration of the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain did not decrease too much, and the rate of decrease was not too fast. It was still decreasing bit by bit. If any of the Tao Master's disciples discovered this at this time, they would definitely hate Luo Fan to the core. However, it was clear that all the disciples of the Tao Masters had been pulled into his own world group and were thrown into the various worlds and space-times to contribute to the evolution of his world group. But how could there be any Tao Master's disciples who could discover this? As for whether this would happen or not, it was needless to say. If the concentration of the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain would not be affected by the dispersion of the creation energy in the Tao Master's domain, why did the high-level Tao Master's disciples separate the two back then? Why did they condense the creation energy that was originally in the independent cultivator's domain into the Tao Master's domain? Of course, it was because if it was dispersed, the concentration would be reduced too much, and the efficiency of cultivation would be lower. That was why they had paid a huge price to do so. Otherwise, did they do all this just to show off their outstanding skills? How could an existence who had cultivated to such a high level be so bored? At this time, Luo Fan did not care much about the outside world, or even his doppelganger. At this time, he just concentrated on comprehending the barrier in front of him at this moment, comprehending the combination of the layers of mysteries contained in it, and the organic use of the layers of mysteries. He tried his best to comprehend the mysteries contained in it, but they were not as profound as the previous few levels of the Tao Master's path that he had understood before. Compared to before, when he could not find a way at all, now it was as if he had found the key. Really, whatever he comprehended, the barrier that was originally so complicated that it could not be seen clearly was becoming clearer every moment, and he even felt that his understanding of the mysteries had further deepened every moment. From time to time, he would let out such an exclamation. It turns out that this kind of principle can produce such changes. It turns out that the combination of these two principles can actually produce such an effect. As he exclaimed, he felt that there was a faint flash of spiritual light around his body, and layers of barriers appeared around his body out of thin air, before quickly dissipating into thin air. Just like that, the cycle continued without end. Every time the barrier appeared, there would be some improvement compared to the previous one. The structure of the barrier became more complex and mysterious. Unknowingly, after trillions of barriers have been created and destroyed, the barrier that appeared around Luo Fan's body once again was shining, exuding an extremely strong aura that belonged to the world of laws. It existed around his body, and it felt as if countless worlds of laws were stacked together and completely wrapped around him, exuding a kind of eternal and indestructible charm. However, even so, when he added something to it, it still couldn't withstand it. Once again, it collapsed, just like the trillions of times it had done before. Chapter 22:38. Through his deep understanding of the barrier, Luo Fan was sure that in addition to the mystery of the fourth level of the Tao Master that he had already comprehended, there were four more profound, more complicated, and more difficult to understand mysteries. If there was a mystery of the first level of the Tao Master's path, then, by preliminary calculation, the disciple of the Tao Master who built the barrier should have mastered at least 8 different mysteries. That was to say, if there was no fundamental change in the reason, then the disciple of the Tao Master should at least have reached the 8th level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, he had already reached that level hundreds of millions of years ago. After all, this barrier was built hundreds of millions of years ago. Luo Fan floated in the void, a trace of shock flashing through his eyes. In a trance, he seemed to see an incomparably huge figure that filled the heaven and earth and shrouded all the heavens and realms above his head, covering all the heaven and earth that he could see. I didn't expect it to be the existence of the 8th level. He murmured, but gradually an indescribable excitement and fighting spirit emerged in his eyes. Although he was confident, he would never lose his self-awareness. Compared to almost all the disciples of the town masters he had met, he was already ahead of them. Even if it was the disciple of the 5th level of the town master, he was confident enough to defeat them. However, it did not mean that he would be arrogant enough to think that he could be invincible under the true divine level. It did not mean that he really thought that he could defeat the experts at the 8th level of the town master's path. At least for the current him, the disciples of the 8th level of the town master's path were still in a position that was almost impossible to resist. If such an existence really wanted to deal with him, he was afraid that the other party's understanding of the mysteries of the level was not deep enough to completely erase him. However, even though he knew that such an existence was much stronger than him, Luo Fan was not discouraged because of this. He thought that he should obey the wishes of the expert and not even dare to challenge him. On the contrary, because of the strength of the existence, his fighting spirit soared, and he was excited to see the means of the existence at that level. Let me see how profound the skills of a Dao master at the 8th level are, he murmured, his eyes focused, and his spirit was even more focused on the barrier. He tried even harder to dig out the deeper mysteries of the barrier. He wanted to dig out the various subtle and complicated principles of the higher levels that were revealed. The mysteries of each level of the town master's path were extremely complicated. If there was no corresponding environment, it would be at least tens of thousands of times more difficult to comprehend the mysteries than if there was an appropriate environment. Otherwise, why would those true sages open up such a huge road to become a town master? Even if a true sage was omnipotent, his power and might shouldn't be squandered like this. Therefore, at this time, if Luo Fan wanted to comprehend the mysteries of the barrier in advance, and even the mysteries that had been transformed by the expert and had a deep connection with the other levels, it could be imagined how difficult it was. Even though he tried his best to dig deeper and comprehend with all his might, after over 3 million years, he was only able to gain a deeper understanding of the various mysteries of the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st level. He was still completely clueless about the mystery of the 5th level. In fact, he did not even know which of the remaining 4 mysteries it was. What a pity! In the end, he could only sigh and stop this almost futile effort. After more than 3 million years of effort, the barrier formed by the spiritual light around his body had become extremely stable. It didn't look as obvious as before, but it was faintly discernible. At first glance, it was just a faint layer of fluorescence covering the surface of his body. Only by careful observation and careful discrimination could one see that the fluorescence was mixed with endless runes and lines, which contained infinite profound principles and mysteries. This structure was naturally much weaker than the barrier that separated the Dao Master's domain and the Rogue Cultivator's domain, but compared to the barrier that he could condense at will, it was not much weaker. As for the barrier that was constructed by the middle-aged cultivator who was now imprisoning his doppelganger in the domain of creation power, it was at least 100 times stronger. Because the doppelganger and the original body could be connected through other levels. From the beginning, the time flow between Luo Fan's doppelganger and the original body was already the same. In other words, at this moment, his original body had experienced more than 3 million years outside, and the doppelganger had only stayed in the domain of creation power, where time was extremely accelerated for more than 3 million years. However, as the middle-aged cultivator had expected, who knows how many billions of trillions of years had passed, 3 million years might be extremely long in the eyes of ordinary living beings. But for an existence like Luo Fan, it was not much different from the blink of an eye. The middle-aged cultivator would not think that 3 million years was long. In fact, even though more than 3 million years had passed, he was still suppressing Luo Fan's doppelganger and building a barrier around the doppelganger's origin of life that was similar to the barrier that separated the Rogue Cultivator's domain and the Dao Master's domain. Compared to more than 3 million years ago, this structure was naturally countless times more complicated and perfect. At this moment, there were countless runes and lines around the doppelganger's origin of life. These runes and lines were formed by the condensation of the most mysterious rays of light. They contained infinite power, and even the power of the world group was only an extremely basic and ordinary part of it. The countless runes and lines had already formed a complete system. Although it still had a strong sense of existence, compared to before, it no longer felt broken, and there was a sense of perfection. Obviously, the construction of the barrier had already reached the final moment. Next, the barrier would most likely be completed at any time. In fact, the reason why Luo Fan stopped comprehending the barrier at this time was not only because he found it difficult to find any more gains, but also because his avatar was about to be completely sealed. This was also one of the important reasons. It must be known that the middle-aged cultivator was an expert from the 5th level or even higher. It went without saying that such an existence's methods were brilliant. Although it seemed that there would not be any impact now, who knew what methods the other party would use to dig out his secrets after his origin of life was completely sealed? Even if he wanted to see what methods the other party had, he would not hand over his fundamental secrets to the other party and let the other party use them. In other words, at this moment, what he needed to do was to stop the other party. The middle-aged cultivator was no different from how he was 3 million years ago. Even his willpower, emotions, and attitude had not changed. He was still as passionate as before. It was as if the past 3 million years didn't leave a trace in his heart at all. "Come on, hand over your secrets," he muttered as he raised his hand and pointed at the seal that smashed into the head of Luo Fan's clone. As he pointed, rays of light began to flicker madly from the seal. All kinds of invisible power penetrated the body of Luo Fan's avatar and rushed towards his soul and life source. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved, and the clone suddenly took action without any warning. At this moment, countless sharp blades emerged from his origin of life and cut into the barrier that was constantly being constructed around him. If the barrier was truly complete or even perfect, it would naturally be flawless. The sharp blades, formed from the power of the world, would naturally not be able to cut into it. But it was a pity that the barrier was not flawless at this moment. Among them, there were still some tiny loopholes, or rather flaws. These loopholes and flaws were naturally nothing under normal circumstances. As soon as the barrier circulated, they would naturally be covered up. However, at this moment, when Luo Fan had already discovered these loopholes and flaws, they were clearly fatal. At this moment, the hunters forcibly cut into the structure and directly blocked it, causing the structure that was originally only one step away from flawless to instantly stop functioning. Many of the originally unstable structures began to rapidly collapse, and the originally tiny loopholes and flaws began to rapidly increase and increase. At this moment, the runes and lines that the middle-aged cultivator had thrown over to complete the structure were like a boulder that had been placed on a fragile frame. In an instant, the structure exploded with a loud bang. Countless fragments directly tore apart Luo Fan's body, and the seal that was originally on his head completely collapsed. How is this possible? At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator's eyes were filled with intense disbelief. It was rare for him to lose control of himself like this and say such words. But this was not his fault. In fact, if other cultivators had seen everything that had happened, they might not have simply lost control of themselves. Their worldview might have been overturned, and they might even suffer from chi deviation. Luo Fan did not know, but the middle-aged cultivator could not be more clear about this. This barrier had been around for countless trillions of years since it had been created. There were countless cultivators who had comprehended this barrier. Among them, there was no lack of powerhouses who were of a higher level than him. However, among so many powerhouses, none of them could comprehend even a trace of the mysteries of this barrier in a shorter time than him. It was precisely because the difficulty of comprehending this barrier was simply too great that he was the only one who could feel a sense of accomplishment from this barrier and still stayed on the 4th level to comprehend this barrier. At this moment, This individual who had clearly just ascended to the fourth level and had not even stayed here for more than 100 million years had actually obtained benefits from the barrier. In fact, he had even thoroughly comprehended the comprehension that he had obtained after spending trillions of years to break the divine ability that he had constructed based on the barrier. This situation simply showed that this rogue cultivator's comprehension was stronger than any other expert he had seen before. How could he not be shocked? How could he not lose control of himself? Naturally, Luo Fan was not in the mood to understand the middle-aged cultivator's loss of control at this moment. At this moment, everything inside and outside of his body had disappeared except for the origin of life. If he wanted to continue fighting, he obviously could not do so in this state. Therefore, at this moment, he circulated his origin of life and created endless power and matter out of thin air. He quickly formed the outline, and in the blink of an eye, his body, divine soul, power, and the space-time in his body had been completely constructed. Moreover, this construction vaguely coincided with the mysterious structure that he had comprehended from the barrier. As this structure was constructed, he felt that the influence of the creation force on him had weakened unprecedentedly. In the past, if he wanted to establish a foothold in the creation force, he would need to use the power protection that he had obtained from his own cluster of worlds. But now, with this structure, he no longer needed to guide any power to gather on his body. Just by relying on his own body and the circulation of his own power, he could easily resist the creation force. Facing the boundless pitch-black power, no matter how the power struck him, he remained unmoved and unscathed. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator just came back to his senses and saw the process of the birth of Luo Fan's body. He murmured, and the shock in his eyes became even more intense. Then, he thought of something, and his eyes flashed with an even more intense light. Is this because of the secret that he possesses? That must be it. This secret can actually give him such a powerful comprehension. If I obtain it, won't I be able to instantly comprehend all the mysteries of the barrier and no longer need to stay on this level? With this thought, the gaze that he looked at Luo Fan's clone became even more scorching. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed. As expected, you still haven't given up. You should know that the better you perform, the more interested I am in your secret. The middle-aged cultivator sneered. As he spoke, the Genesis energy that was under his control began to stir. Compared to before, there was an indescribable change in the way it circulated. It was self-sufficient, self-contained, and the feeling of being completely isolated from the outside world became even more intense. Sensing this change, Luo Fan instantly understood what the other party was doing. You think that I had a way to contact my main body just now? The middle-aged cultivator said indifferently. Of course, apart from this possibility, there is no other way that you can retaliate against me. That's not necessarily true. How do you know that I didn't rely on the so-called secret that you mentioned to do all of this? Luo Fan smiled faintly. As he spoke, he casually waved his hand, and the creation force around him began to fall into silence. The silence here formed a strong contrast with the rapid turbulence of the creation force outside, causing an extremely obvious mark to form at the border between the two, as if there was a scratch that completely separated the two sides. The middle-aged cultivator's eyes lit up. This method of controlling the creation force had clearly grasped some of the true essence of the barrier. Even if it was him, it would not be easy for him to achieve this step. He might need to spend dozens of breaths of time before he could do it. Compared to Luo Fan, who was able to do it in an instant, it was clearly a little inferior. But even so, the middle-aged cultivator did not show any signs of backing down. Instead, he remained strong, and the light in his eyes became even more intense and scorching. What a secret that I yearned for! Such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, Luo Fan turned his right hand slightly, clenched it into a fist, and threw it at the middle-aged cultivator from afar. Luo Fan's body didn't seem to have much power or effect from this attack. However, the creation force in the outside world underwent an earth-shattering change under this punch. In a trance, The creation force began to transform rapidly, turning into layers of light that combined into a huge fist. It directly broke through the air and arrived in front of the middle-aged cultivator, completely enveloping his body. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator felt as if his body was tightly bound by some incomparably terrifying power. Even the circulation of his power seemed to have stagnated, and every thought in his mind seemed to require more energy. This punch condensed the infinite mysteries of the fourth, third, second, and first levels of the Tao Master's path that Luo Fan had walked through. They were combined together in an organic way, complementing each other, promoting each other, and finally achieving the effect of mutual sublimation. This made their combined power tens of thousands of times stronger than their individual power. If Senior Sister May had appeared in front of this fist, she would have been completely defeated by this fist without any resistance. She would not even have had the time to escape with the help of the Tao Master's prison. In the face of such an attack, the middle-aged cultivator simply shouted. Then, without going through any process, his palm appeared in front of the fist out of thin air. Without any hesitation, he lightly patted the fist. In the blink of an eye, a boundless, terrifying power was injected into the fist, causing it to suddenly collapse like it was made of smoke. It turned into wisps of mist and disappeared without a trace. Although you've already done everything you can, you've done your best. However, the gap between our realms is something you can't resist. The middle-aged cultivator shouted. Chapter 22:39. As he spoke, a ray of light suddenly appeared on the middle-aged cultivator's body. This ray of light was vivid and lifelike, as if it was a real living thing. In the blink of an eye, it condensed above his head. It seemed to have eyebrows and eyes, and one could even faintly hear an extremely strange language coming from it. After this ray of light appeared, Luo Fan felt as if he was being stared at by something. He felt as if there was a sharp blade on his back. At this moment, the ray of light seemed to be wriggling extremely slowly, changing into all sorts of strange forms. At times, it condensed into a number of legs, and at other times, it condensed into a number of wings. At other times, it turned into a strange head, and at other times, it displayed a strange figure. The various forms were almost at the limit of the imagination of living beings. According to the understanding of time for ordinary living beings, these strange changes would probably take many years to complete. However, at this moment, the ray of light displayed so many complicated changes from beginning to end, and in the end, it did not even take any time. Even though Luo Fan had seen every detail of its changes from beginning to end, in the end, he still found that the time was basically the same as before. The entire process of the light's changes did not seem to take any time at all. When such a contradictory feeling appeared, Luo Fan's expression changed greatly, and he became extremely solemn. This was because he knew very well that the appearance of this feeling meant that the ray of light before him had the ability to distort his perception of time. He couldn't be any clearer about this. For example, when one said a long sentence to an enemy, but one's opponent could hear every word of this sentence extremely clearly in an instant. For example, a punch that was originally extremely fast, but in the end, the opponent could see it clearly and recognize every detail of this punch. And so on, he had done such things too many times. And in order to achieve all of this, Luo Fan was extremely clear about the goal that had to be achieved. This was something that could only be achieved when one's control of time was far superior to the opponent's, or even reached the point where it could affect or even control the opponent's perception of time. In other words, the fact that this ray of light could make him feel so contradictory meant that, at least in terms of time, it was superior to him. How could he not be serious when he understood this? This is one of the four mysteries that I haven't comprehended yet. After a moment of solemnity, he quickly came to a conclusion, and his eyes began to shine with a probing light. The changes produced by the light before him were so subtle and mysterious that even Luo Fan couldn't understand them. However, after comparing it with the various principles within the barrier, he discovered that one of the 8 types of mysterious principles within the barrier was somewhat similar to the feeling emitted by the light in front of him. After confirming this, he naturally understood what the middle-aged cultivator meant by the difference in cultivation level. Using a profound mystery that surpasses the 4th level to deal with me? Then let me see what kind of power this profound mystery has. With that in mind, he focused his mind and raised his hand to grab at the void. A 3-legged cauldron appeared in front of him. At first glance, this 3-legged cauldron looked exactly the same as the one he used to deal with Senior Sister May. But if one looked carefully, one would notice that the scene inside the 3-legged cauldron was completely different from before. Back then, the interior of the 3-legged cauldron was just a chaotic scene of countless lights and shadows mixed together. But now, the interior of the 3-legged cauldron was a boundless void. It was just like the void in the rogue cultivator's domain at the very beginning. If one's perception was just a little sharper and observation ability was just a little stronger, one would even be able to see the indescribable barrier that filled every corner of the void and enveloped the entire void. That barrier seemed to be somewhat similar to the barrier that separated the rogue cultivator's domain from the Tao Master's domain. Of course, compared to the calm and stable barrier between the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain, the barrier in the depths of the 3-legged cauldron was extremely active, and there were billions of changes occurring within it at every moment. And every change seemed to be brewing unimaginable power at the same time, as if any one of them was enough to completely crush a world group. At this moment, the light above the middle-aged cultivator's head that seemed to be alive slightly froze. A chirping sound came from it. Then, Luo Fan felt that his body was restricted by some indescribable mysterious power. This mysterious power was different from any power that he had ever known. Whether it was the power of the world group, the power of concept, or even the power of worldview, they were all fundamentally different from this mysterious power. Goodbye. I originally wanted to keep your consciousness, but now it seems that it's better for your consciousness to be erased. Anyway, I only want your memory. The middle-aged cultivator seemed to look at Luo Fan with pity and said so. Before Luo Fan could react, that incomparably mysterious power had already moved slightly. With this movement, all the internal structures of Luo Fan's body began to collapse, whether it was his body or his power, whether it was the space-time within his body, his soul, or even his life source and life essence. In the blink of an eye, he felt a sense of dizziness, and a feeling of dying arose spontaneously. In a trance, he felt as if he had entered the abyss of death. At this moment, he clearly saw what changes had happened to his clone through his main body. He saw that the mysterious power had seeped into everything inside his body, and with a sudden force, it completely shattered his body, causing his existence in this plane of reality to completely lose its original structure. His entire body directly turned into a cloud of indistinguishable smoke, and his will turned into endless light that mixed with the smoke. It was further worn down by the power, and bits and pieces of it were continuously extinguished at this moment. An indescribable power descended from nowhere and began to move towards the middle-aged cultivator. Sensing this power, the middle-aged cultivator's expression changed. The light above his head that seemed like a living thing emitted an unwilling emotion, and with a slight tremble, it collapsed and disappeared. As the light disappeared, the power that descended out of nowhere disappeared after a moment of confusion. It was as if he had suddenly lost the target that he was supposed to descend upon. I was almost discovered by the Tao Lord's prison. Sensing that the power had disappeared, the middle-aged cultivator heaved a sigh of relief. The power that suddenly descended was none other than the power of the Tao Lord's prison. And the reason why this power had descended was because he had used that light before. That light was actually a method that he had extracted from the mysteries of the 4th level of the Tao Lord's path. This method had already exceeded the limits of the 4th level. Once it was used, it would naturally trigger the Tao Master's purgatory, allowing the Tao Master's purgatory to confirm his identity and know that he had gone against the flow. Naturally, A power would descend to drag him into the Down Master's purgatory to suppress him. It was precisely because of this drawback that he had not used this method before, and had only used the barrier to conceal it to indirectly use the various things he had comprehended in the higher levels. But this is enough. So what if I use the mysteries of the lower levels to create a flower? The gap between levels is not so easy to overcome, the middle-aged cultivator said indifferently. As he spoke, he raised his hand and grabbed at the cloud of smoke that Luo Fan had turned into. With this grab, an invisible force entered the cloud of smoke and began to search for the nearly indestructible memories hidden within. You clearly know that my main body has a way to contact my avatar. So why do you still think that you can truly subdue me by just dealing with this avatar? At this moment, Luo Fan's voice came from the smoke. This voice immediately made the middle-aged cultivator frown. Just now, Luo Fan's avatar had indeed been completely dealt with. If it wasn't for his main body constantly paying attention to the avatar through other levels and regathering the avatar's consciousness when it was destroyed, the avatar might really have been completely destroyed and its memories would have been completely taken by the middle-aged cultivator. Unfortunately, this kind of if did not exist. After the avatar's consciousness was obliterated, his main body immediately regathered that consciousness, allowing that consciousness to regain control of his shattered body and everything else. Although he still endured the constant destruction of the mysterious power during this process, and had to resist the power's erosion of his consciousness at all times, in the end, he was still able to control his memories. He was able to make it so that anyone who wanted to take his memories would first have to completely destroy his consciousness. As a result, the middle-aged cultivator's original plan was completely thwarted. I originally planned to let your main body live, but it seems that won't be possible now. After a while, the middle-aged cultivator sighed with a somewhat pitiful expression and a hint of killing intent. That's not up to you. Luo Fan sighed. With this, the middle-aged cultivator's expression suddenly changed. Because at this moment, he suddenly felt that the domain of creation power that he had originally constructed to imprison Luo Fan's clone, which was completely isolated from the outside world, had been reversed at this moment. The domain that was originally used to imprison his opponent had now become the one that was imprisoning him. "What did you do?" he shouted softly. Following his words, the surrounding creation power that was independent from the outside world began to riot. All kinds of lights were born and frantically rushed out. Just as those rays of light were about to charge out of the domain and step into the boundless power of creation outside, a subtle barrier appeared before them, completely blocking their path. It was the same no matter which direction they were in. During this process of obstruction, an extremely violent riot clearly appeared on the barrier and was born in front of the lights. However, even Luo Fan and the middle-aged cultivator did not feel any sound coming from within their bodies. Just by listening to the sound, one would not even think that this collision was very intense. One could only imagine how terrifying the impact was by looking at the various terrifying fluctuations that were released and the creation and destruction of a universe, worlds, and space-time that were created and destroyed by the fluctuations. It must be known that even the most intense exchange of moves between Luo Fan and the middle-aged cultivator and the change of the creation power was far less than 1/10,000th of the change in the creation power around the barrier. It went without saying how terrifying this impact was. I still have to thank you for your reminder. If you hadn't demonstrated that method, I wouldn't have been able to control this barrier to this extent. At this moment, Luo Fan's voice rang in the middle-aged cultivator's ears. Hearing this, the middle-aged cultivator's expression darkened. How many times had this been? Every time he displayed a method that was enough to subdue his opponent, it did not take long for the opponent to say that he had advanced a step with his help. Whether this was true or not, it was enough to make him feel extremely displeased. If you haven't entered that level, no matter how you comprehend it, it's all specious, he said coldly. As he spoke, the light that was derived from the creation power around him increased by thousands of times. As the light surged, he revealed a strenuous expression. His entire body was trembling, and his face had turned indescribably pale. Sweat continuously seeped out of his pores. By the time the boundless power of creation had turned into light, even his aura had begun to weaken. It was as if in order to support this change, even his origin had been greatly consumed. With this change, whether it was to the outside or inside, the pressure that the light emitted had increased by countless times. Under the pressure of the light, Luo Fan's clone in the domain had been forcibly compressed into a small dot. A small dot that couldn't even be measured by size. Even this small dot was still enduring the boundless and terrifying pressure at this moment. The entire dot trembled from time to time, and there seemed to be even more powerful pressure constantly invading the depths of this small, trying to completely disintegrate the internal structure of this small dot. The pressure inside was already so terrifying, so there was no need to mention the pressure on the outside, which the light originally targeted, the barrier. Under the impact of the light, the barrier outside began to shake constantly. Cracks began to appear on the barrier. At first, these cracks were only small marks, and if one didn't look carefully, they might even be completely ignored. But as time passed, as the light increased, the cracks became more and more obvious, and the cracks grew larger and larger. In the end, under Luo Fan's inexplicable gaze, the barrier finally collapsed completely. However, after it collapsed, it didn't completely turn into countless fragments like ordinary things would when they collapsed. Instead, it unfolded in an extremely strange manner, turning back into a flat surface and disappearing without a trace in a flash. This was because the barrier itself wasn't actually constructed by Luo Fan. Instead, he used a method that he comprehended from a method that the middle-aged cultivator used to curl up the part of the barrier that still existed between the two domains into a sphere, and then transferred it to the surroundings to envelop the portion of the creation power that the middle-aged cultivator controlled. In this way, there was naturally a difference between the nature of the barrier and the power that condensed the barrier into a sphere. Even if Luo Fan completely concealed this difference and tried to make it as small as possible, he couldn't really make it disappear. Therefore, under the pressure of the light transformed by the infinite creation power, the barrier itself wasn't damaged at all, but the power that shifted and distorted the barrier into a sphere couldn't withstand it and was directly destroyed. It was precisely because of this that after the spherical barrier was destroyed, it didn't shatter into countless fragments. Instead, it unfolded into a flat surface and instantly disappeared without a trace. The moment the barrier was broken, the light began to converge, and in the blink of an eye, it had already converged above his head, forming an ever-changing, lifelike form. Impressively, it was the same form that had easily crushed Luo Fan's clone. As the light converged, the middle-aged cultivator's incomparable fatigue, which was as if his origin had been consumed, began to gradually fade, and his expression and aura began to recover rapidly. All of this seemed rather complicated, but in fact the entire process took an extremely short time, from the birth of the light until it broke through the barrier and converged above his head. Less than a breath of time had passed. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator looked up and found that almost 1/10 of the rogue cultivator's domain had been connected with the Tao Master's domain. In other words, 1/10 of the rogue cultivator's domain had been retracted into the Tao Master's domain and reintegrated with the domain of the Tao Master. The timing isn't right. He frowned, and this thought flashed through his mind. According to his original thought, he had spent more than 3 million years in the independent domain that he had created, and it should only have been a few breaths outside. With this distance, the cultivator wouldn't have advanced too much in destroying the barrier. Even if he could see that the damage had increased, it shouldn't be too obvious. Chapter 2240. Depending on the size of the secret, one's feelings would be greatly different. For example, to an ordinary wealthy person in the mortal world, if another person possessed a treasure that could extend one's lifespan, then he would definitely be filled with greed, and he would absolutely desire to possess such a treasure. However, if that person suddenly turned into an immortal and held an immortal's magic treasure in his hand, then the rich man would only feel fear. Previously, in the eyes of the middle-aged cultivator, the secret that Luo Fan possessed was like a treasure that could extend one's lifespan in the hands of an ordinary person. Of course, the only thing that would appear in his heart would be greed. But now, after discovering that the connection between Luo Fan's main body and his doppelganger was so close that it toppled his worldview, this secret had become as terrifying as a magic treasure in the hands of an immortal. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator felt the urge to retreat for the first time. Perhaps this person's secret is not something that I can pry into. This thought involuntarily emerged in his heart, causing his movements to become slightly sluggish. At this moment, he suddenly frowned. The miraculous light that had already gathered around his body began to converge, directly merging into his body. He looked no different from how he was at the beginning, and one could not even sense any special power from his body. It was as if in the blink of an eye, he had turned from a supreme expert who could destroy the heavens and earth into an ordinary middle-aged man who did not even have the strength to truss a chicken. After doing this, he heaved a sigh of relief and looked in a certain direction. He saw that somewhere in the Tao Master's domain, the endless power of the Tao Master's prison was constantly surging and gathering in that direction like waves. It felt as if it was going to completely break through that location and drown everything hidden within it. Just at this moment, a thunderous sound erupted from that location. A light that contained endless power surged out from it, tearing apart the Genesis energy, tearing apart the void, and tearing apart the plane of reality. This light was so terrifying that it was countless times more powerful and terrifying than the light that the middle-aged man had displayed before. Who is it? He's been hiding here for so long without me noticing. The middle-aged cultivator's expression was extremely solemn, and his eyes were filled with indescribable shock. At the same time, the desire to retreat hidden in the depths of his eyes became unprecedentedly strong. One must know that he had always thought that he was the most powerful expert in the fourth level. However, not only did the rogue cultivator that he looked down on hide a secret that he could not pry into, but there was also such a powerful expert hidden in a place that he thought did not exist. How could he remain calm? Senior Sister May? At this moment, the expression of Luo Fan, who was sitting in his own world group, changed slightly and revealed an indescribable curiosity in his eyes. The place that had changed was none other than the place where he had sealed Senior Sister May, or rather, of the position of the place in the real world group. At this moment, Senior Sister May had used some unknown method to forcefully tear open the barrier between the planes. She was currently heading towards the real world at an incomparably fast speed. At the same time, she also activated the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison, causing the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to surge towards her like never before. What's the point of this? Even if I break free from the seal, I'll just be captured and suppressed by the Tao Master's prison. Doubts flashed through his mind. At this moment, Senior Sister May's body, wrapped in the endless terrifying light, broke through the layers of seals on her and appeared out of thin air in the middle of the endless creation power of the fourth level of the Tao Master's road. At the same time, the surging power of the Tao Master's prison had already rushed to her side and completely drowned her. At this moment, there was no despair on Senior Sister May's face. Instead, there was an indescribable heartache and pity. Then, a blood-red light began to expand from her body, and in the blink of an eye, it had enveloped her body. The blood-red light was extremely mysterious, and its presence was even stronger than Senior Sister May's. If the two were to be compared, the blood-red light was like the real body, while Senior Sister May's body was like a shadow. After the light appeared on the surface of her body, it began to distort and change, displaying all sorts of strange forms, as if it was a real living being. This kind of feeling was somewhat similar to that of the ball of light that the middle-aged cultivator had released earlier, which was like a living thing. At this moment, the power of the Tao Master's prison had already forcefully poured into the blood-red light, completely enveloping it from the inside out. Then, the power of the Tao Master's prison began to surge, and the blood-red light gradually turned illusory. Not long after, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. Only Senior Sister May, who was no longer enveloped by the blood-red light, remained on the spot. The heartache on her face could not be concealed at all. There's actually such a substitution technique, as expected of a Tao Master's disciple. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. Although he had never seen Senior Sister May use such a method on anyone else, he had never seen anyone else use it. But he could not be more clear about the result of this technique. After all, the power of the Tao Master's prison was obviously triggered by Senior Sister May. The purpose of their arrival was to capture Senior Sister May, who had used the power that the fourth level could not contain, into the Tao Master's prison to suppress and punish her. However, she did not expect the power of the Tao Sovereign's purgatory to completely ignore her. Instead, it captured the blood-red light that was being emitted from her body. Even if they had not seen this process before, they should know that it was a substitution technique that could deceive the Tao Master's prison. And judging from her heartache, this substitution technique clearly had a great limit. The price she had to pay to use it once was enough to make the Tao Master's prison, who had already ascended to a higher level, feel heartache. How dare you do such a thing? All of a sudden, Senior Sister May's expression changed drastically. Indescribable anger and panic appeared in her eyes, and even her voice became like a scream. At this moment, she no longer looked as charming as she did before. Right now, she looked like a village woman who was throwing a tantrum. At this moment, she had clearly seen the changes in the Tao Master's domain. She saw that the barrier that separated the Tao Master's domain from the Rogue Cultivator's domain had been largely destroyed after the scream. She did not care about what happened to Luo Fan, the other Tao Masters, or the middle-aged cultivator who clearly did not fit in with the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Instead, an extremely strange, obscure, and mysterious fluctuation began to radiate from her body. After the fluctuation left her body, it began to stir the void, stirring up the endless power of creation in the surroundings. It even seeped through the power of creation into the void behind the power of creation, and after some indescribable change and sublimation, it was about to advance to an even more subtle place. Oh no, she's summoning the Tao Master's domain from the fifth level. Stop her! At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator roared in shock and anger. If it was just between him and Luo Fan, he was naturally Luo Fan's opponent and enemy. The two of them could not be said to be irreconcilable, but it was difficult for them to coexist peacefully. However, if there was a higher-level Tao Master's domain, then the situation would obviously be different. No matter which level he was a rogue cultivator, he was still a rogue cultivator. Perhaps to him, who had already transcended the fourth level, the Tao Master's domain was no longer in his eyes, so they could not be considered his enemies. However, he could no longer ignore the Tao Master's domain on the fifth level or even higher. One had to know that with the Tao Master's style, it was impossible for them to not offend the rogue cultivators on the fifth level and coexist peacefully. They would definitely oppress the rogue cultivators on the fifth level and above. Under such circumstances, to the middle-aged cultivator, the higher-level Tao Master's domain was obviously irreconcilable. Since the Tao Master's domain was like this to him, he was naturally not a welcome guest to the Tao Master's domain. Therefore, it could be imagined that when the higher-level Tao Master's domain descended and discovered his existence, they would definitely not be stingy in attacking him and conveniently erasing him. It was precisely because he understood this that the middle-aged cultivator did not care about the life and death battle between him and Luo Fan, and directly asked Luo Fan to stop Senior Sister May from the perspective of being on the same side. Luo Fan followed the good and flowed. At this moment, he only smiled, and a wave of power instantly swept across the endless power of creation and swept toward Senior Sister May. A barrier instantly sealed off Senior Martial Sister May. This barrier was not the one that sealed Senior Sister May, but the one that he had comprehended when he was fighting with the middle-aged cultivator. It was the barrier that separated the rogue cultivator's domain from the Tao Master's domain. Senior Sister May instinctively wanted to use the method she had used to break the seal to resist this barrier. When the boundless light collided with the barrier, it instantly produced an earth-shattering tremor. Boundless ripples, boundless heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time were born from the boundless power of creation around the point of impact, and then quickly disappeared without a trace. Then, they reappeared and disappeared again, forming a seemingly never-ending cycle. Following this chaos, the summoning fluctuation that Senior Sister May had previously released was naturally cut off. Senior Sister May's body suffered too great of an impact, and she could not help but spit out a large mouthful of blood. Her face turned pale, and it took her a long time to recover. Wouldn't it be fine if you obediently let yourself be sealed? When it's about time, I'll let you out. What's the use of paying such a huge sacrifice to escape now? Luo Fan sighed, and his figure condensed in front of Senior Sister May. Senior Sister May looked at him, and her expression changed slightly. When she was previously sealed, she did not feel the passage of time at all. As soon as she came out, she immediately saw that the barrier between the Dao Master's domain and the Rogue Cultivator's domain had been destroyed. She began to seek for other Dao Master's disciples who were at the same or higher level as her, and had no time to calculate how much time had passed. In this way, the Luo Fan in her mind was naturally not much different from the one who had sealed her. She didn't expect that from the beginning until now. Luo Fan's every move had given her a huge shock. Compared to the state where he could only use some tricks to win in front of her, the current him was simply not at the same level as before. Just his aura alone was far superior to before. Do you know how big a mistake you have made? Senior Sister May gathered her thoughts and said coldly. At this moment, her expression had already recovered. The sorry state that had appeared on her body earlier had already been swept away. Clearly, she had calmed down once again. Did I make a mistake? It is true for you, but for the rogue cultivators, I am afraid that I have created great merit. Luo Fan only smiled and said, Merit? From what I can see, he doesn't seem like he's acknowledging your merits. Senior Sister May said indifferently. At this time, Luo Fan felt a familiar power shrouding his body. This was the power that had caused his doppelganger to collapse, and he had to rely on the support of his main body in order to barely recover. It was also the power that was released by the middle-aged cultivator, which was like a living thing. It changes really fast. Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. Bang! With a soft sound, his body was instantly destroyed, and everything was completely wiped out. It was as if he had never existed in the fourth level. Moreover, with his disappearance, the huge vortex of creation power seemed to tremble slightly, as if it was about to collapse. However, it only seemed like it. Although it trembled a few times, it still quickly stabilized. Then, a figure that seemed to have existed since the beginning of time appeared not far away from the middle-aged cultivator, quietly looking at the middle-aged cultivator. Naturally, it was Luo Fan, who had been resurrected through the connection between the other levels and the real world. I thought we could cooperate a little. Luo Fan sighed, and a look of pity appeared on his face. Hearing this, the middle-aged cultivator had a look of disbelief on his face, and he exclaimed, How is this possible? I've clearly erased everything about you. How can you still be alive? At this time, Senior Sister May sneered and said, If it wasn't because he had such a method, why do you think I would need to summon other powerhouses? Her words were filled with strong unwillingness and bewilderment. Chapter 22:41. At this moment, Luo Fan obviously had no intention of waiting for the other party to react. Since the other party had launched a sneak attack on him just now, he was naturally prepared to suffer a backlash. At this moment, he did not hesitate to summon the barrier between the levels. In an instant, the middle-aged cultivator was directly wrapped in the barrier, and with a pull, the middle-aged cultivator was pulled into the barrier between the reality level and the conceptual level. Following this change, in the eyes of Senior Sister May, the middle-aged cultivator had already fallen into the previous state of being sealed by Luo Fan, and directly disappeared from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. What method did you use? Even after seeing him again, Senior Sister May was still shocked by the means he had used, and an extremely grave expression appeared on her face. The reason why she was able to escape just now was because she had sacrificed the only magic treasure she had obtained in the fifth level. Although she had already escaped, she still had no idea what kind of method Luo Fan had used. If she were to encounter such a seal again, she still had no idea how to escape. In other words, if Luo Fan used the same means to seal her now, she actually had no confidence that she would be able to escape. In fact, it was precisely because of this that she immediately activated the summoning as soon as she escaped and summoned the high-level disciples of the Tao Master to deal with Luo Fan. Otherwise, after suffering such a big loss, why would she not want to deal with Luo Fan herself? Why would she so easily decide to hand over the task of dealing with Luo Fan to someone else? It seems that you have no other means. Luo Fan looked at Senior Sister May and said thoughtfully. Hearing this, Senior Sister May's expression suddenly changed. This was the truth, but the meaning behind it was completely different when it was said directly by the other party. Immediately, she said, "Do you want to try? Do you really think that a small rogue cultivator like you can really suppress the disciples of the Tao Master in terms of means?" Luo Fan just smiled and raised his hand to point at the huge whirlpool in the distance. He did not speak, but his meaning could not be clearer. After all, the vortex could be said to be the root cause of the collapse of the barrier between the territory of the rogue cultivators and the territory of the Tao Master. It was also the place where the wills of the Tao Masters were sucked into the group of worlds. No matter which one it was Luo Fan's victory over the Tao Master's disciples. In other words, the existence of this vortex was the most direct refutation of Senior May's words. But Luo Fan didn't even need to say anything to refute. Senior Sister May was quick-witted and naturally understood his meaning in an instant. Her expression suddenly stiffened. At this time, she secretly scolded the disciples of the Tao Masters of the fourth level for being so disappointing. They were all caught in one fell swoop in such a short time. It's just a little advantage, and you're already so arrogant? You just haven't pushed them to their limits yet. If you push them to their limits, each of them will be able to burst out with explosive power that is not inferior to mine. If you don't believe me, you could try. Senior Sister May said lightly. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "You're making me a little afraid." As he spoke, he raised his hand and was about to grab the whirlpool. At this moment, Senior Sister May's expression suddenly changed. She did not expect Luo Fan to be so violent. What she said before was naturally not a lie. If the disciples of the Tao Masters really went all out, they would indeed be able to burst out with explosive power that was far beyond their original limits and display power that was far beyond their own ability. However, what she did not say was that in order to burst out such power that was beyond their limits, the price that the disciples of the Tao Masters had to pay must be unimaginably huge. Perhaps, with a single sacrifice, these disciples of the Tao Masters would return to a state of having nothing overnight, and they would become inferior to ordinary rogue cultivators. Given this person's methods, even if he paid such a price and burst out an attack that was beyond his limits, he did not seem to have absolute confidence that he could win or even escape. In this way, this kind of price would only make the rogue cultivator in front of him exclaim in surprise for a moment. There was no meaning to it at all. If this really happened, when the disciples of the Tao Masters found out that it was because of what she said that the rogue cultivator forced them to pay the price and burst out an attack that was beyond their limits, they would most likely tear her to shreds. Don't worry, there is no irreconcilable hatred between me and the disciples of the Tao Masters. At this moment, Luo Fan's words instantly pulled Senior Sister May out of the abyss of helplessness. Hearing this, Senior Sister May was stunned and said, "What do you mean? Do you still think that there is the possibility of us reconciling after what you've done?" As she spoke, she could not help but sneer disdainfully. As a disciple of the Tao Master, she was born to be high and mighty. She was born to be above all rogue cultivators. All rogue cultivators were born to be exploited by her and should be a level lower than others in front of her. Any actions that were detrimental to the disciples of the Tao Masters were naturally abhorrent to her and could not be forgiven. Under such circumstances, everything that Luo Fan did might seem to him to be for the sake of his own cultivation. He was merely making use of the disciples of the Tao Masters. However, to Senior Sister Mei, it was an unforgivable provocation. If it was not for the fact that she could not think of a way to break through the seal that Luo Fan had placed on her, she would have long summoned the strongest disciple of the Tao Masters that she could contact to get rid of him. Why would she have the time to talk nonsense with him? Even at this moment, she seemed to be communicating with Luo Fan, but in fact, she was constantly analyzing the seal in the surroundings, trying to think of a way to break through it. When Luo Fan heard this, he smiled and said, "Reconciling? I don't think I need to reconcile with you." His words caused Senior Sister Mei's expression to change again. What kind of arrogance was this? Although the disciples of the Tao Masters are the direct disciples of the Tao Masters, cultivation is a personal matter. If you want to become a Tao Master, you really have to rely on yourself. No matter what your identity is, you are no different from us rogue cultivators in terms of the ultimate goal of becoming a Tao Master. What right do you have to stand above the rogue cultivators? What right do you have to make everyone be wary of you? What right do you have to make everyone be afraid of you? There is no difference whether our relationship is reconciled or strained or even irreconcilable, Luo Fan said. His words made Senior Sister Mei's eyes burn with intense flames of anger. How arrogant! You won't be able to stand on the path of a Tao Master just because of this. Senior Sister Mei's voice sounded like a wild beast's roar. His voice was mixed with boundless shock, boundless anger, and even a deeply hidden sense of panic. At this moment, Senior Sister Mei was no longer as charming as before. All that was left was anger and even madness. For her, Luo Fan's various thoughts had already shaken the high and mighty foundation of the Tao Master. If all rogue cultivators thought like this, the Tao Master's disciples would never have a day of peace. They might even be knocked off their pedestals, and from then on, they would be stuck in the mud with the rogue cultivators. This was not something that a Tao Master's disciple, like Senior Sister Mei, could accept. In her opinion, what Luo Fan had displayed was even more unforgivable than what he had done to break the barrier between the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain. Compared to the rogue cultivator on the third floor, who had also mixed the rogue cultivator's domain with the Tao Master's domain and expelled or killed the Tao Master's domain, it was even more unforgivable. This might seem incredible, but the logic behind it couldn't be any simpler. For the Tao Master's disciples, if they could split the path of becoming a Tao Master once, they could naturally split it countless times. Now that the third and fourth floors had been mixed together, there was no longer any difference between the rogue cultivator's domain and the Tao Master's domain. It seemed that the real fairness had been achieved. However, in the eyes of the Tao Master's high-level disciples, this was only temporary. It was only because the real experts did not care about this change that this state could appear and be maintained. If the matter really got out of hand and the real experts paid attention to it, then it would only be a matter of a thought for the various floors to be divided again. Even if it really attracted the attention of the higher-ups, this division might be even more absolute and irresistible than before. In this way, although they would be unhappy with the changes in the lower levels, they would be angry and would want to tear the rogue cultivator into pieces. In fact, they would not take them seriously. At most, they would think that the rogue cultivator was just an ant who could jump around. However, compared to this, Luo Fan had directly erased the status of the Tao Master's disciples, thought that there was no difference between the Tao Master's disciples and rogue cultivators, and thought that the Tao Master's disciples had no better chance of becoming a Tao Master than the rogue cultivators. For the Tao Master's disciples, this was an absolutely unforgivable provocation. If such thoughts and views were really accepted by all rogue cultivators, then the status of the Tao Master's disciples would no longer be as stable as it was now. Then the other rogue cultivators who were encouraged by such views and ideas would probably have a shocking impact on the rule of the Tao Master's disciples. In the end, The losses they would suffer would be countless times greater than the loss of the Tao Master's path. After all, in addition to the Tao Master's disciples, there were also many rogue cultivators at the higher levels. Thinking of countless rogue cultivators pouncing on her, shouting for equality and freedom. The killing intent in Senior Sister May's heart grew stronger. I must not let this person ascend to a higher level. At this moment, such a decision emerged from the bottom of her heart. Even the idea of self-sacrifice emerged from the bottom of her heart. Although Luo Fan did not know the specific way in which Senior Sister may change her mind, he clearly knew that after he finished speaking, the woman's momentum suddenly changed. Originally, it seemed that she just wanted to escape, but now it had become an indescribable killing intent. A killing intent that could not wait to perish together with him. Such a spirit of sacrifice. It's like that of a martyr who has sacrificed everything to protect his ideals. Looking at this woman, Luo Fan could not help but have such a thought, and his eyes could not help but show a sense of inquiry. At this moment, a faint light began to emerge from Senior Sister May's body. This light quickly attacked the barrier created by Luo Fan, which was formed by the mysteries of the first 4 levels of the Tao Master's path. Compared to the power of the Simple World Group, this barrier was thousands of times stronger. However, compared to the mysteries of the 5th level, it was obviously not strong enough. At this moment, under the impact of the light that seemed to be alive, the barrier began to shake and cracks constantly appeared on the barrier. Even though the barrier's power was quickly mending, its sound and movement did not disappear because of this mending. Instead, it was constantly emitting countless strange sounds. This sound stirred up the surrounding power of creation, causing the power of creation to give birth to countless strange worlds, and space-time. It looked like an incomparably strange sound wave world that was constantly being born and destroyed. At the same time, the power of the Tao Master's prison began to appear faintly in the surroundings. The power of the Tao Master's prison was obviously superior to the Tao Master's path. Even if there was endless creation energy in the surroundings, even if the creation energy could pull out a world, and a space-time from the river of time, it was still powerless in the face of the power of the Tao Master's purgatory. He couldn't even touch them. The two overlapped and did not even affect or interact with each other. It was as if they were on 2 different levels, 2 different dimensions. When it first appeared, the power of the Tao Master's purgatory was like a headless fly, scurrying around like a headless fly. It seemed to know that the cause of its appearance existed in this area, but it was unable to determine where it was or what it was. As time passed, as the light released from Senior Sister May's body became more and more intense and dazzling, the area that the power of the Tao Master's prison locked on seemed to become smaller and smaller. The feeling that seemed illusory and real gradually changed towards reality. Chapter 2242. After witnessing the middle-aged, loose cultivator display the light that was condensed into a living being, as well as the light that Senior Sister May displayed a few times, which was incomplete, but already had the characteristics of a living being, Luo Fan finally comprehended a trace of the essence of this light. Living things were something that ordinary living things were born with. It was naturally an incredible miracle to be able to condense them with one's own strength and will. However, for cultivators, as long as they reached the Khanate Grand Luo, splitting the heavens and earth was a piece of cake. Creating living things depended on one's own will. Under such circumstances, what was the big deal about using one's own will and strength to create living things? Khanate Grand Luo cultivators were merely ants to any cultivator who could step onto the Tao Master path, let alone Senior Sister May, who was a powerful existence who had already stepped onto the 5th level of the Tao Master path. For existences at their level, they could even casually create worlds formed by billions of heavens and earth. How could they take the will of a living thing seriously? However, it was clear that regardless of whether it was the cultivator from before or Senior May, both of them attached unimaginable importance to the light that was like a living thing. In fact, the power of the lifelike light had already surpassed the imagination of all living things. It was far above the world group. This kind of contradiction had already made Luo Fan somewhat puzzled and moved from the beginning. However, because he did not know anything about the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, he did not force himself to dig out its secrets or replicate the method. Since he did not know the mysteries of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, he did not force himself to dig out its secrets or replicate the method. However, after seeing the incomplete display of the lifelike light displayed by Senior Sister May, coupled with the power of the lifelike light displayed by the middle-aged cultivator, he finally grasped a key point and found a trace of the essence of the light. The light itself naturally contained a supreme power that surpassed the power of the world group. There was no doubt about this. However, the will that was derived from the light that controlled this power was not the will of an ordinary living thing. It was a higher level will that far surpassed the level of living things. It was the will of the world. This kind of will existed in every world. However, the will of this kind of existence varied depending on the world. Moreover, even if it was created, it was impossible to control or understand this kind of will. From the beginning of their existence, they completely followed the needs of their own world or the world. They controlled the world, operated the world, and operated the world. This kind of will was obviously an existence that did not have much meaning to the creator of the world. This was Luo Fan's understanding of the will of the world. It was precisely because of this understanding that he had never thought of controlling the world will. Even if there were countless world wills that had been born under his hands, he had never thought of controlling the world will. He did not want to use the world will as his own power to fight his enemies. However, at this moment, Senior Sister May had appeared in front of him, as well as the middle-aged rogue cultivator from the fifth level, who had been completely sealed by him. It was clear that Pina had done something that he had not been able to do before. She had taken control of the will of the world. In other words, they had taken the initiative to condense a will of the world that was completely under their control. Looking at their control over the light and the supreme might that was emitted from the light, it was obvious that their control over the will of the world had already reached the acme of perfection. There was not the slightest bit of reluctance, nor was there the slightest bit of indirection. It was as though these wills were an extension of their will. After understanding the nature of the light, Luo Fan felt that the light was completely different when he looked at it again. Previously, he could only see that it was a ball of light. At most, it was like a living thing. But now, when he looked at it again, he found that the light contained endless rules and principles, endless time and space, endless matter and energy, and endless wonderful power that could not be described with words or even measured. All of this was completely under the command of the will of the world. All the conflicts and contradictions existing in it were swept away by the will at the level of the will of the world, and they were completely integrated into a complete, unified whole. In the end, everything was sublimated and released a terrifying power that was far beyond the mysteries contained in the first 4 levels of the Tao Master's Road. It's indeed worthy of the mysteries contained in the 5th level. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but exclaim. At this moment, the barrier that he had built, which was formed by the combination of the mysteries contained in the first 4 levels of the Tao Master's Road, was completely torn apart by the light that was like a living thing. The incomparably strong light instantly tore apart the cover of the power of creation and spread in all directions, leaving deep marks in the power of creation that could not be healed for a long time. At this moment, the power of the Tao Master's prison in the surroundings seemed to have suddenly found a target and began to quickly gather towards the light. It wrapped the light in it and continuously sent it into the Tao Master's prison. However, they could only be used on the balls of light that seemed to be alive. Senior Sister May, who was the main body that released the light, did not do anything at all. It was as if these rays of light were the true main body, and Senior May was merely an extension of these rays of light. She can actually use such a method to deal with the power of the Tao Master's prison. She is indeed worthy of being a disciple of the Tao Master. Luo Fan sighed again, his eyes full of admiration. He did not know how many times he had felt this way ever since he met Senior Sister May. However, every time she used her power, he still felt that his horizons were widened, and he could not help but sigh with the same emotion. Compared to Luo Fan's admiration, Senior Sister May was obviously not so relaxed at this moment. At this moment, as the light that was like a living thing was being sent into the Tao Master's prison, she looked more and more exhausted. Her body trembled continuously during this process. It felt as if a knife was constantly cutting her flesh. As for her aura, it became weaker and weaker with this change. The power in her body surged endlessly, and an indescribable pain appeared on her face. Her eyes flickered with indescribable madness and determination. After the admiration, Luo Fan sighed and said, "Is it really worth it to use such a method? I don't know how you did it, but what you're doing now is equivalent to sending your doppelganger into the Tao Master's prison to take your place. You've already divided millions of light balls, which is equivalent to creating millions of doppelgangers to take your place. This is millions of times more painful than directly entering with your real body. Do you really think it's worth it to pay such a price?" Hearing his words, Senior Sister May's expression did not change at all. With a loud roar, her body was enveloped by the endless light and the power of the Tao Master's prison as she charged towards him. With this charge, the surrounding creation power seemed to be swept up by her and began to charge towards Luo Fan along with her charge. The power of creation was clearly an incomparably mysterious power. It even contained some characteristics of the state of chaos. The changes that could be produced by such power were naturally endless. At this moment, under the influence of the light that was like a living thing, they began to transform into the light at an unimaginable speed. In other words, they were transformed into the endless laws, time, space, matter, energy, and mysterious power that made up the light. As Senior Sister May approached Luo Fan, the light on her body became stronger and more terrifying. Even if the power of the Tao Master's purgatory was constantly removing the light, it could not change the trend of the change. Puff! With a soft sound, the light had already completely submerged Luo Fan's body. Endless terrifying power rushed towards him, and the power of the world group, the barrier that he had comprehended from the Tao Master's domain and the rogue cultivator's domain, and even the power of the concept divine ability that he had hidden at the bottom of the world of laws, were instantly dispersed by the light. Throughout the entire process, there was not even the slightest impact or turbulence. It was as if all the impact and turbulence had been annihilated by the light and could no longer appear. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan did not allow his body to be annihilated and then resurrect with the help of the connection between the other planes and reality. After all, this kind of thing required a bit of time. Obviously, he could not afford to waste this little bit of time when he needed to restrict Senior Sister May's contact with the higher levels. Therefore, at this moment, with just a slight movement of his mind, a barrier appeared around his body, blocking the overwhelming light that was rushing towards him like a living thing. Although the nature of the light was extremely high and contained the mysteries of the will of heaven and earth, as well as endless rules of law and time and space. Ultimately, it had not reached the realm of surpassing reality. In the end, the barrier between the levels that Luo Fan had summoned was still so powerless. In front of the barrier, all the light was like a wave hitting a dam. It could only set off huge waves, but could not shake the barrier at all. At this moment, Senior Sister May did not pay attention to Luo Fan at all. At this moment, she was trying hard to send her own will through the fluctuations to the higher levels. She was trying her best to penetrate the barrier between the levels of the Tao Master's Road and enter the 5th or even the 6th level. Unfortunately, she had obviously misjudged Luo Fan's response this time. In the previous attack, in order to better understand her means, Luo Fan had used his own body to receive her attack. Therefore, after her attack, there would usually be a process of his body disappearing. During this process, everything related to him would become weak. Even the world group would show signs of collapse and destruction for a while. If Luo Fan had responded to Senior Sister May's attack according to the previous response, then at this time, there would be a flaw in the interception of Senior Sister May's connection. And this flaw would be enough for her to transmit her will to the higher levels and attract the disciples of the higher levels of the Tao Master. However, obviously, at this time, Luo Fan did not choose to do so. At this time, he was perfectly protected by the barrier between the levels. Even his body did not suffer much impact. How could there be a flaw because of the death of his body in the reality? Without this flaw, how could Senior Sister May's plan succeed? At that moment, the fluctuations that contained her will directly collided with the barrier between the layers. Just like the light that she emitted, which seemed to be a living thing, collided with the barrier around Luo Fan's body. It didn't cause any ripples at all, and it completely collapsed. Sensing this change, Senior Sister May's pupils shrank, and a look of despair appeared in her eyes. This despair was not because she was going to be imprisoned in the Tao Master's prison. Instead, it was because she no longer had any chance to cut off the malignant tumor that was Luo Fan. It's a pity that my decision is a little late, she murmured in despair. At this time, the power of the Tao Master's prison had completely penetrated all the obstruction of the light around her body. It directly wrapped around her body and pulled her, making her more and more illusory and blurry. Not long after, only a faintly discernible shadow of her was left, as if she could disappear at any time. This was obviously the scene of her being pulled towards the Tao Master's prison by the power of the Tao Master's prison. It's not that your decision is too late. Luo Fan looked at this scene and murmured. Perhaps, in Senior Sister May's opinion, if she had made the previous decision when Luo Fan was still understanding her methods and seized the opportunity to summon a high-level expert, Luo Fan would have been erased by a Tao Master of a higher level by now. However, only he knew that if Senior Sister May had really done this, he would have already used the mysteries of the various levels to get rid of her. After all, although Senior Sister May's strength surpassed that of Luo Fan, who had just stepped into the 4th level not long ago, in the real world. However, that was only in the real world. In other levels, such as the conceptual level or the karma level, Senior Sister May was not much better than a dead object. If Luo Fan really wanted to, he could easily crush her corresponding existence through those levels. At that time, the Senior Sister May in the real world would naturally die soon and her soul would dissipate.